chemicals and anti-convulsants. Do I have to teach you your job?
Okay, I'm on it.
They told her to sit down. She was just a child. But what happened in the next 60 seconds would change everything. The cabin was chaos. 3 doctors surrounded the convulsing woman in seat 2A, their faces masks of confusion and growing panic. A billionaire was dying at 35,000 feet, and the best medical minds on that plane had no idea what was killing her. Passengers pressed against the first-class curtain, some with phones out, recording what they thought would be a tragedy. The lead doctor barked orders while another checked vitals for the 4th time, shaking his head. Nothing was working. Nothing made sense. And then, through the crowd of 200 passengers, a small voice cut through the chaos. A 9-year-old girl, barely 4.5 feet tall, pushed her way past adults twice her size. Her hand reached out toward the dying woman, her eyes sharp with a knowledge that shouldn't exist in someone so young. The head doctor turned, annoyance flashing across his face. He opened his mouth to tell her to go back to her seat, to let the professionals handle this. He had no idea that this little girl was about to do something that would leave every medical expert on that plane speechless. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back 6 hours, to where this impossible story really began. Lagos Murtala Muhammad International Airport buzzed with the usual controlled chaos of international travel. Among the crowds of business travelers and tourists, a small girl stood at the departure gate, clutching a worn backpack to her chest like it contained the most precious thing in the world. Because it did. Amara Njoku was 9 years old, traveling alone for the first time in her life. She stood barely taller than the check-in counter, her hair pulled back into 2 neat braids that her father had spent an hour perfecting that morning. Her dark eyes scanned the departure board with an intensity that seemed far too serious for a child her age. Those eyes had seen too much grief for 9 years on Earth. Inside her backpack were clothes for 2 weeks, a stuffed elephant named Kendi that had been a gift from her mother, and 3 leather-bound notebooks that most people would assume were diaries. They weren't. They were filled with medical research so advanced that pharmaceutical companies would have paid millions to access them. But Amara wasn't interested in money. These notebooks were all she had left of her mother. Dr. Chioma Njoku had been a brilliant medical researcher, one of Nigeria's rising stars in tropical medicine and pharmacology. She had dedicated her life to finding treatments for diseases that pharmaceutical companies ignored because they primarily affected poor people in developing countries. There was no profit in saving lives that the world had decided didn't matter enough. But Chioma had mattered to Amara. She had been everything. 2 years ago, when Amara was just 7, her mother had contracted one of the very diseases she'd spent her career trying to cure. The illness had been rare, aggressive, and despite all of Chioma's knowledge, despite every treatment she tried, it had taken her in less than 3 months. Amara's last memory of her mother was in a hospital bed, her once strong hands trembling as she placed those 3 notebooks into her daughter's small palms. Her mother's voice had been barely a whisper. She told Amara that inside those pages was a lifetime of work, of discoveries, of hope for people who had none. She told her daughter that she had a gift, a photographic memory just like her own mother had possessed. She made Amara promise that she would read every page, remember every word, and one day, when she was old enough, finish the work that death had interrupted. Amara had kept that promise. Over the past 2 years, while other 9-year-olds were reading fairy tales and adventure stories, Amara had memorized thousands of pages of medical research. Drug interactions. Toxicology reports. Treatment protocols for diseases with names most people couldn't pronounce. Her father, Kwame, a mechanic who worked 70 hours a week to keep them fed and housed, would come home to find his daughter surrounded by medical journals from the library, her young mind absorbing information that medical students twice her age struggled to understand. He worried about her. She had lost her childhood the day her mother died, and he didn't know how to give it back to her. So when his sister in New York had offered to host Amara for the summer, he had scraped together every spare dollar he had, worked double shifts for 3 months, and bought his daughter an economy-class ticket to America. He hoped that maybe, away from the memories, away from those notebooks, she might remember how to just be a kid again. He had no idea that this flight would prove his daughter was destined for something far greater than a normal childhood. The gate agent smiled kindly at Amara as she checked her documents. Unaccompanied minor. The agent attached a special lanyard around Amara's neck and explained that a flight attendant would be watching over her throughout the journey. Kwame knelt down, his rough mechanic's hands gentle as he adjusted his daughter's collar. He told her he loved her. He told her to be good for her Aunt Blessing. He told her that her mother would be so proud of the young woman she was becoming. Then he watched his only child walk down the jetway, carrying a backpack full of the future, heading toward a destiny neither of them could have imagined. Amara found her seat in Economy 47B, a middle seat near the back of the plane where the engine noise was loudest and the bathrooms created a constant flow of traffic. She wedged her backpack under the seat in front of her and pulled out one of her mother's notebooks, running her fingers over the familiar handwriting. A businessman in the aisle seat glanced over, saw what looked like a child scribbling to his untrained eye, and went back to his laptop. The elderly woman by the window smiled and offered Amara a piece of candy, which she accepted politely. A flight attendant approached, her name tag reading Sandra. She was in her 40s with kind eyes and a warm smile that reminded Amara a little of her mother. Sandra checked Amara's paperwork, confirmed she had everything she needed, and told her that if she required anything at all during the 11-hour flight to New York, she should just press the call button. Amara thanked her and Sandra moved on to check on other passengers, but something about the little girl traveling alone tugged at her heart. She made a mental note to check on her frequently. What Sandra didn't know was that in just a few hours, this quiet 9-year-old would become the most important person on this airplane. Meanwhile, several rows ahead in the exclusive cocoon of first class, a very different kind of passenger was settling into her seat. Victoria Ashford didn't settle as much as she claimed territory. Seat 2A was hers, purchased at a price that could have fed Amara's family for 6 months. At 58, Victoria had built a pharmaceutical empire from absolutely nothing. She had started as a sales representative 4 decades ago, working her way up through sheer ruthlessness, brilliant business instincts, and a willingness to make decisions that kept her competitors up at night. Ashford Pharmaceuticals was now worth $14 billion. Victoria's signature was on patents for drugs that millions of people depended on. She employed 30,000 people across 4 continents. She had been featured on the cover of Fortune magazine 3 times. And she was absolutely miserable. Her assistant, Derek, a nervous man in his 30s who had learned to anticipate her needs before she voiced them, hovered nearby as she arranged her things. Her personal physician, Dr. Raymond Cho, sat across the aisle, ready to attend to any medical need that might arise. Victoria demanded perfection from everyone around her, and she paid well enough that people tolerated her coldness. She had just spent 5 days in Lagos negotiating a deal that had fallen apart at the last minute. Local officials had wanted assurances that any drugs manufactured there would be affordable to Nigerians, not just exported for profit. Victoria had found the demand naive and insulting. She was a businesswoman, not a charity. The meeting had ended badly, and she was returning to New York in a foul mood that everyone around her was desperately trying not to make worse. Derek handed her a phone, and she made a call to her head of operations, her voice sharp as she discussed quarterly projections and the need to cut costs in their research division. She showed no awareness that the flight attendants preparing the cabin could hear every word. To Victoria, people in service positions were essentially invisible unless she needed something from them. Dr. Cho watched her with concern. He had been her personal physician for 7 years and he knew the signs. She was stressed, running herself into the ground the way she always did. When she mentioned a headache, he offered her medication, but she waved him off. She had her own pills, her own routines. She didn't need anyone fussing over her. What Dr. Cho didn't know was that Victoria carried a deeper pain than any headache. 3 years ago, her daughter Clara had confronted her about her priorities. Clara had begged her mother to slow down, to spend time together, to remember that family mattered more than board meetings. Victoria had responded the only way she knew how, with logic and dismissiveness. She had told Clara that everything she built was for her future, that Clara didn't understand the sacrifices required to maintain their lifestyle. Clara had responded by cutting her mother out of her life entirely. 3 years of silence. 3 years of phone calls that went to voicemail. 3 years of holidays spent alone in a penthouse that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Victoria told herself she didn't care. She told herself that Clara would eventually understand. She told herself that work was enough. But late at night, in moments she would never admit to anyone, she wondered if she had traded everything that mattered for an empire that would crumble to dust the moment she died. She pushed those thoughts away as she always did and focused on her laptop, on emails, on anything but the hollow ache in her chest. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard Flight 237 to New York. 11 hours. Victoria had a headache that was getting worse, but she ignored it. She had survived worse than a headache. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxied to the runway, and lifted into the sky, carrying 247 souls toward an encounter that would change multiple lives forever. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, Sandra made her way through the cabin, checking on passengers. She had been a flight attendant for 20 years, and she prided herself on noticing the passengers who needed extra attention. She stopped by Amara's seat, where the little girl was deep in concentration, reading what looked like a medical textbook far too advanced for a child. Sandra smiled and asked if Amara needed anything. Amara looked up, those serious dark eyes meeting Sandra's, and politely declined. Then Amara did something unexpected. She asked Sandra if she was okay. Sandra blinked, surprised. Most passengers never asked flight attendants personal questions. They were there to serve drinks and peanuts, not to be seen as actual human beings. But something in this child's voice was so genuinely concerned that Sandra found herself answering honestly. She mentioned that her daughter had been sick lately, that doctors were running tests but couldn't figure out what was wrong. It was probably nothing, she said, forcing brightness into her voice. Just one of those things. Amara's expression became thoughtful. She asked what symptoms her daughter was experiencing. Sandra, charmed by the child's interest, listed them off, not really expecting anything. Amara listened carefully, then offered to look at the case if Sandra wanted to describe it in more detail later. Sandra smiled, touched by the sweetness of the gesture, but obviously not taking it seriously. A 9-year-old girl wasn't going to solve a medical mystery that had stumped actual doctors. Still, it was kind of her to offer. Sandra thanked her and moved on, making a mental note to bring Amara an extra dessert with dinner. 3 hours into the flight, most passengers had settled into the rhythm of a long journey. Movies played on seatback screens. Some people slept. Others read or worked. In economy, Amara had moved on to a different notebook, her photographic memory cataloging information about drug interactions and tropical diseases. In first class, Victoria's headache had progressed from annoying to concerning. The cabin lights seemed too bright. Her vision was starting to blur slightly at the edges. She took more pills from her personal supply, washing them down with sparkling water that tasted oddly metallic. Derek noticed her wincing and asked if she needed anything. She snapped at him to focus on the work she'd assigned him. Dr. Cho, sitting across the aisle, also noticed. He started to get up to examine her, but Victoria told him sharply that she was fine, that he should stop hovering. Both men exchanged worried glances but knew better than to push her when she was in this mood. Victoria pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to focus on the contract she was reviewing, but the words kept swimming on the page. She told herself it was just stress, just exhaustion, just the aftermath of a frustrating week. She told herself she would rest when she got home. She told herself a lot of things in those final moments before her body began to shut down. What Victoria didn't know was that the herbal supplement she had been given by a business associate in Lagos, something marketed as a natural energy booster and mental clarity enhancer, contained compounds derived from cinchona bark. And when combined with the anti-malarial medication she had been taking as a precaution for her trip, those compounds were creating a toxic chemical reaction in her bloodstream. Her body was being poisoned from the inside, and with every passing minute, the damage was spreading. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to subscribe because what happens next will absolutely shock you. This is just the beginning of a journey that proves that genius has no age limit, and that the most unlikely hero can emerge from the most unexpected place. The plane hummed steadily through the sky, carrying its passengers across the Atlantic Ocean. In seat 47B, a 9-year-old girl studied medical research that could save lives. In seat 2A, a billionaire pharmaceutical CEO struggled against a headache that was about to become something far worse. And neither of them had any idea that in just a few hours, their lives would collide in a way that would make headlines around the world and remind everyone watching that sometimes, the person with all the answers is the one nobody expected. What would you do if you saw doctors failing to save someone's life, and you thought you knew the answer? Would you speak up even if everyone would dismiss you? Let me know in the comments below because Amara Njoku was about to face exactly that choice, and her decision would determine whether a woman lived or died. 3 hours into the flight, something was going terribly wrong in first class, and nobody realized just how bad it was about to get. Victoria Ashford sat rigid in seat 2A, her jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in her neck stood out like cords. The headache that had started as a dull annoyance before takeoff had transformed into something else entirely, something that felt like shards of glass grinding behind her eyes. The cabin lights, dimmed for passenger comfort, felt like they were burning directly into her brain. Every sound, from the whisper of the air conditioning to the quiet murmur of conversation, scraped against her nerves like sandpaper. She had built a $14 billion empire by refusing to show weakness, by pushing through pain and exhaustion that would have broken lesser people. But this was different. This felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, and she hid them quickly in her lap before Derek could notice. She would not be weak. She would not ask for help. She had survived hostile takeovers and boardroom battles and health scares before. She would survive this too. Except she wouldn't. Not without help she didn't know she needed. Derek had been Victoria's assistant for 6 years, which meant he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read her moods and anticipate her needs before she voiced them. It was a survival skill, really. Victoria didn't tolerate incompetence, and she had a very narrow definition of competence. But right now, watching his boss from his seat across the aisle, Derek felt something he rarely experienced around Victoria. He felt genuinely frightened. She was irritable beyond her usual demanding standards. When he had asked her a simple question about scheduling her meetings for the following week, she had snapped at him with a viciousness that seemed disproportionate even for her. Her words had been sharp, cutting, but there was something else. Something in her voice that sounded off. It took him a moment to identify it, and when he did, his stomach dropped. Her speech was slightly slurred, just barely, like someone who had been drinking. But Victoria never drank during flights. She never drank at all, actually. She was fanatically controlled about everything she put in her body. Derek leaned forward, keeping his voice low and respectful. He asked if she was feeling all right, if she needed anything. The look she gave him could have frozen fire. She told him in words dripping with contempt that she was fine, that he should focus on doing his actual job instead of hovering over her like she was some invalid. Then she turned back to her laptop, dismissing him completely. But Derek noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Victoria's fingers on the keyboard were moving strangely, missing keys, having to backtrack and correct more than he'd ever seen. Victoria had the fastest, most accurate typing speed of anyone he knew. She prided herself on it. This wasn't right. Dr. Raymond Cho had been watching Victoria too, his trained medical eye picking up signs that she was trying desperately to hide. He had seen her massage her temples 3 times in the past 20 minutes. He had noticed the way she kept adjusting the air vent above her seat, first directing it toward her face, then away, then back again, like she couldn't regulate her temperature. When she reached up to adjust it again, he saw that her hand was shaking. He unbuckled his seatbelt and moved across the aisle, settling into the empty seat beside her. His voice was gentle, professional. He told her he'd noticed she seemed uncomfortable and asked if he could check her vitals. Victoria's response was immediate and cold. She told him she had a headache, nothing more, and that she didn't need him to make a production out of it. She had already taken medication. She was handling it. He should go back to his seat. But Dr. Cho had not kept his position as personal physician to one of the world's most demanding patients by being easily dismissed when medical concerns were at stake. He pressed gently. He reminded her that altitude could exacerbate certain conditions, that stress combined with changes in air pressure could trigger serious issues. He suggested that it would take just 2 minutes to check her blood pressure and heart rate, just to be safe. Victoria closed her laptop with more force than necessary. Fine, she said. If it would get him to stop pestering her, fine. But make it quick. Dr. Cho pulled a small medical kit from the overhead bin and took her blood pressure. Slightly elevated, but not alarmingly so. Her pulse was faster than normal, but that could be explained by stress and irritation. He checked her pupils with a small light, and that's when he felt the first real flutter of concern. Her pupils were dilating slowly, just a fraction slower than they should. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice, but Dr. Cho had been practicing medicine for 30 years. Subtle was often the first warning sign that something major was coming. He asked about her symptoms. Describe the headache, he said. Where was it located? Was it throbbing or constant? Any visual disturbances? Nausea? Sensitivity to light or sound? Victoria answered tersely. Severe headache, yes. Mostly behind her eyes and at the base of her skull. The lights were bothering her, but that was probably just the cheap LED bulbs the airline used. No nausea. No, wait, actually, maybe a little. She had felt slightly queasy earlier but had attributed it to the airplane food she'd forced herself to eat. She just needed to rest. The medication would kick in soon. Dr. Cho asked what medication she had taken. Victoria waved dismissively at her purse, telling him it was just the same thing she always took for headaches, along with her anti-malarial medication that she took religiously when traveling to certain regions. Plus that herbal supplement that business associate had recommended. All perfectly safe. Dr. Cho wanted to examine the supplements, to see exactly what she'd been taking, but Victoria's patience had run out. She told him with finality that she was done being examined, that he should return to his seat, and that she would call him if she needed him. The tone of her voice made it clear that the conversation was over. Dr. Cho reluctantly returned to his seat, but the uneasy feeling in his gut only grew stronger. He had no way of knowing that in Victoria's bloodstream, a chemical storm was building. The cinchona alkaloids from her herbal supplement were interacting with the quinine-based anti-malarial drugs in a way that her body could not process. The combination was creating a toxic cascade effect, and with every passing minute, the concentration in her system was increasing. Her nervous system was being bombarded with compounds that were supposed to help her but were instead slowly poisoning her. The headache wasn't stress. The light sensitivity wasn't altitude. Her body was desperately trying to warn her that something catastrophic was happening, but she had spent a lifetime ignoring her body's warnings in pursuit of success. And now that lifetime of pushing through pain was about to exact a terrible price. In the back of the plane, Amara Njoku stood up from her seat, needing to use the bathroom. The businessman in the aisle seat moved grudgingly to let her pass, and she made her way up the narrow economy aisle toward the lavatories. The line was long, as it always was on international flights, and Amara found herself standing near the curtain that separated economy from the premium cabins. She had never been in first class. She had never even seen it except in movies. Curiosity, the same curiosity that drove her to devour her mother's medical research, made her peek through the small gap in the curtain. What she saw made her pause. A woman in one of the front seats, an elegant older woman in expensive clothes, was leaning back with her eyes closed, her face contorted in obvious pain. Even from this distance, even as a 9-year-old child, Amara recognized the body language of someone suffering. She watched as a man in a suit, probably a doctor based on the medical kit beside him, said something to the woman. The woman's response was sharp, angry, her hand gesturing in clear dismissal. Amara felt a flutter of concern but didn't know what she could possibly do. She was a child. The woman obviously had medical care. A flight attendant noticed Amara near the curtain and gently guided her back toward the economy bathroom line, smiling kindly. Amara returned to her seat a few minutes later, but the image of that woman's pained expression lingered in her mind. Something about it bothered her, though she couldn't say exactly why. She pulled out her mother's second notebook and opened to a section on neurological symptoms and toxic reactions. She had read these pages dozens of times, but today for some reason she felt drawn to review them again. Her photographic memory pulled up the information effortlessly. Symptoms of quinine toxicity. Synchronism. The progression from headache and tinnitus to visual disturbances, confusion, and eventually seizures and cardiovascular collapse. She didn't know why she was thinking about this now. She turned the page and kept reading. 30 minutes later, everything changed. Victoria had been trying to focus on an email, the words blurring together on her screen in a way that had nothing to do with the small font size. Derek had asked her another question, something about a meeting she had scheduled, and she had opened her mouth to answer when the words came out wrong. They were slurred, garbled, like her tongue had suddenly become too thick for her mouth. She tried again, concentrating hard, but the second attempt was even worse. Derek's eyes went wide. He leaned forward, alarm clear on his face, and asked her to repeat what she'd said. Victoria felt a spike of fear cut through the pain in her head. Why couldn't she speak properly? She tried again, but this time no words came out at all. Her mouth opened and closed, but only a strange strangled sound emerged. And then her entire body locked up. Every muscle seized simultaneously, her back arching against the seat, her hands curling into rigid claws. The laptop slid from her lap and clattered to the floor. Her eyes rolled back in her head, showing only the whites. And then the convulsions began. Victoria's body jerked violently, her arms and legs thrashing with such force that Derek scrambled backward, knocking into the aisle. The seatbelt kept her partially restrained, but her head snapped back and forth, smashing against the headrest. Foam began to form at the corners of her mouth. The sounds coming from her throat were inhuman, guttural, the sound of a body completely out of its owner's control. Derek screamed for help, his voice high and panicked, cutting through the quiet murmur of the cabin like a knife. Passengers in nearby seats jumped up, craning to see what was happening. Dr. Cho was already moving, unbuckling and lunging across the aisle to his patient. He grabbed Victoria's head, trying to stabilize it to prevent her from injuring herself. Her pupils were fully dilated now, the left one significantly larger than the right, unresponsive to the cabin light shining directly into it. Dr. Cho shouted to Derek to hit the call button, to get the flight attendants immediately. His hands moved quickly, checking her carotid pulse. It was racing dangerously fast, her heart hammering like it was trying to escape her chest. He tilted her head back to make sure her airway was clear, terrified that she might aspirate if she vomited during the seizure. Sandra appeared within seconds, her professional calm firmly in place despite the shock of seeing a passenger in full convulsive seizure. She immediately grabbed the intercom handset and made the announcement that would change everything. Her voice carried through every speaker in the aircraft, calm but urgent. Was there a doctor on board? They had a medical emergency in first class and needed immediate assistance. 2 passengers responded almost simultaneously. Dr. Patricia Mills, a cardiologist from Boston who had been dozing in business class, made her way forward quickly. Dr. James Kowalski, an emergency room physician from Chicago who had been in economy, pushed his way up the aisle with the practiced efficiency of someone who dealt with crisis situations daily. Both of them took in the scene in first class with experienced eyes, and both of them felt the same sinking sensation. This was bad. This was very, very bad. Dr. Cho looked up at his colleagues with barely concealed relief and dread. He quickly summarized what he knew. Patient was Victoria Ashford, 58 years old, no significant medical history beyond controlled hypertension. She had complained of a severe headache for the past hour, showed signs of irritability and slightly slurred speech, and then suddenly went into convulsions approximately 2 minutes ago. Pupils were dilated and unequal. Heart rate was approximately 140 beats per minute. Blood pressure had been slightly elevated when he checked it 30 minutes prior. Dr. Mills immediately began her assessment, her fingers on Victoria's wrist checking the pulse while her eyes scanned the patient's face. The convulsions were starting to slow, but Victoria remained completely unresponsive. Dr. Kowalski checked her pupils again with his phone's flashlight, noting the alarming asymmetry. The right pupil was responding sluggishly. The left was blown wide and fixed. That was not good. That suggested significant neurological involvement, possibly a brain bleed or stroke. Dr. Mills asked what medications Victoria had taken. Dr. Cho listed them. Standard headache medication, anti-malarial drugs for her recent travel, and an herbal supplement. Did they have the supplement? Could they see exactly what was in it? Dr. Cho scrambled to find Victoria's purse, dumping the contents onto the empty seat. He found the bottle and handed it to Dr. Mills. She scanned the label, her brow furrowing. The ingredient list was in multiple languages, some of which she couldn't read, and it claimed to contain a proprietary blend of natural compounds for energy and mental clarity. Completely useless information for determining what might be causing this reaction. Dr. Kowalski was checking Victoria's breathing. It was rapid and shallow, not good, but at least she was breathing on her own. He asked Sandra if the plane had an AED and emergency medical supplies. Sandra was already moving, returning seconds later with the aircraft's emergency medical kit. It was better than nothing, but all 3 doctors knew that what they had available was nowhere near sufficient for a crisis of this magnitude. The convulsions had stopped, but Victoria remained unconscious, her body limp except for occasional twitches. Dr. Mills checked her blood pressure with the kit's manual cuff. It had spiked even higher now, 170/110. Her heart was racing like she'd just run a marathon. These weren't the vital signs of someone having a simple seizure. This was something else, something they were missing. Dr. Kowalski voiced what they were all thinking. They needed to figure out what this was, and they needed to figure it out fast. He ran through the possibilities out loud, partly to organize his own thoughts and partly to get input from his colleagues. Stroke? Possible, given the unequal pupils and the sudden onset. Brain aneurysm? Also possible. Allergic reaction? Less likely given the progression of symptoms. Seizure disorder? But she had no history of epilepsy, and seizure disorders didn't typically cause this kind of pupillary response. Dr. Mills suggested they start her on oxygen immediately and see if they could get an 4-line established. Even if they didn't know what they were treating, they could at least try to stabilize her vital signs. Dr. Cho agreed, already pulling the oxygen mask from the emergency kit. They fitted it over Victoria's face, adjusting the flow to maximum. Her oxygen saturation was low, 87%, definitely not good enough. Dr. Kowalski attempted to establish an 4-line in Victoria's arm, but her veins were difficult to access, probably due to the vasoconstriction from her elevated blood pressure and stress response. On his 3rd attempt, he finally got the needle in and taped it securely. They started a saline drip, hoping to at least maintain her blood volume and give them a route to administer medications if needed. But what medications? That was the question that hung in the air between the 3 doctors. They didn't know what they were treating. Was this a clot that needed blood thinners? Or a bleed that blood thinners would make catastrophically worse? Was this a toxin? An infection? A structural problem with her brain? Derek, Victoria's assistant, was standing nearby, his face pale and streaked with tears. He kept asking if she was going to be okay, his voice breaking on the words. None of the doctors could give him an answer. They didn't know. They honestly didn't know. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional in the way that pilots are trained to be even in emergencies. He announced that due to a medical emergency, they would be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest suitable airport. Ground control had been notified, and emergency services would be standing by. Their estimated time to landing was approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes. Dr. Mills exchanged glances with her colleagues. Victoria might not have 90 minutes. Her condition was deteriorating even as they watched. Her breathing was becoming more labored despite the oxygen. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of poor circulation and oxygenation. The monitors they had available were limited, but every sign they could measure was pointing in the wrong direction. Dr. Cho made a suggestion, his voice tight with desperation. Could this be a tropical illness? Victoria had just returned from Nigeria. She had been taking anti-malarial medication, but there were other diseases, other parasites and infections that could cause neurological symptoms. Cerebral malaria, perhaps, although they usually presented with fever. Or something rarer, something they might not even have heard of. Dr. Kowalski considered it. It was possible, but even if it was a tropical illness, what could they do about it on an airplane at 35,000 feet? The emergency medical kit had some antibiotics and anti-inflammatories, but nothing that would touch a serious parasitic infection or rare tropical disease. And they couldn't just start throwing medications at her blindly. The wrong drug could kill her just as easily as the disease. The three doctors tried everything they could think of with their limited resources. They administered anti-seizure medication from the emergency kit, hoping to prevent further convulsions. They monitored her vital signs obsessively, watching the numbers fluctuate in ways that made no logical sense. They repositioned her to ensure her airway remained clear. They did everything their training had prepared them for. And nothing worked. Nothing stabilized her. Victoria's condition continued to deteriorate, minute by agonizing minute. Passengers throughout the cabin were becoming aware that something serious was happening. The word spread in whispers from row to row. Someone was dying in first class. Someone important, someone rich. People had their phones out, some filming through gaps in seats, some texting loved ones, some just staring in horrified fascination. The cabin crew tried to maintain order, asking people to remain seated to give the doctors space to work. But the atmosphere on the plane had changed. Fear had settled over the aircraft like a fog. Sandra moved through the aisles, trying to project calm while her own heart raced. She had been a flight attendant for 20 years, had dealt with medical emergencies before, but never one like this. Never one where 3 qualified doctors looked this scared. She checked on passengers, assured them that everything possible was being done, reminded them to stay seated with their seatbelts fastened. When she passed through economy, she saw Amara Njoku sitting rigid in her seat, her young face tight with concentration. The girl was staring toward the front of the plane like she could see through the walls and curtains to whatever was happening in first class. Back in first class, Derek was falling apart. He had worked for Victoria for 6 years, had been yelled at and criticized and pushed to his limits more times than he could count, but in this moment, the thought of losing her was unbearable. She was difficult, yes, demanding and cold and often cruel. But she was also brilliant and driven and had taught him more about business and resilience than anyone else in his life. He kept asking the doctors what was happening, why she wasn't getting better, why wasn't the medication working. Dr. Mills turned to him, her expression gentle despite the stress she was under. She asked him to tell them everything he could remember about the past few hours. What had Victoria eaten? Who had she talked to? What had she done differently than usual? Any detail, no matter how small, might be important. Derek tried to think, his mind racing. She had been irritable, but that was normal for Victoria. She had mentioned a headache, had taken her usual medications. She had worked on her laptop. She had made phone calls. She had mentioned that someone in Lagos had given her an herbal supplement. A business associate. She had said it was supposed to help with energy and mental clarity, that it was all natural, perfectly safe. She had taken it for the past 3 days, taking it regularly because the person who gave it to her said it worked best with consistent use. Dr. Cho grabbed the supplement bottle again, studying it more carefully. All natural didn't mean safe. Natural compounds could be just as dangerous as synthetic drugs, sometimes more so because they weren't regulated or standardized. He wished he could identify exactly what was in this blend, but the label was deliberately vague, probably to avoid regulatory scrutiny. It could contain anything. It could contain compounds that interacted catastrophically with her anti-malarial medication. But even if that was the cause, what could they do about it? They didn't have activated charcoal to absorb the toxins. They didn't have chelating agents or antidotes. They had 4 fluids and basic medications and 3 very frightened doctors who were watching a patient die and couldn't stop it. 85 minutes to landing. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, providing an update. They were in contact with ground control. Emergency medical services would be ready the moment they landed. Just hold on. Everyone just needed to hold on. But Victoria's vital signs were dropping. Her heart rate, which had been racing dangerously high, was now becoming irregular, skipping beats in a way that made Dr. Mill's stomach clench with dread. That was a sign that her heart was struggling, that the electrical system that kept it beating in rhythm was being disrupted. If she went into cardiac arrest at this altitude with these resources, her chances of survival were minimal. Dr. Kowalski was checking her pupils again, and what he saw made him curse under his breath. Both pupils were now fully dilated and completely unresponsive to light. That was a very bad sign, suggesting severe damage to the brainstem or significant intracranial pressure. This woman was slipping away, and there was nothing they could do except watch it happen. The 3 doctors looked at each other, the same terrible knowledge passing between them unspoken. They were losing her. Despite their years of training, despite their experience, despite everything they were trying, Victoria Ashford was dying. And they had no idea why, which meant they had no idea how to save her. Derek saw the look that passed between the doctors and he understood what it meant. He sank into a nearby seat, his hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Other passengers watched with a mixture of sympathy and fear. If someone that rich, someone with her own personal doctor and immediate access to 3 physicians, couldn't be saved, what chance would any of them have in a similar situation? Sandra stood near the galley, her professional composure cracking as she watched the scene unfold. She thought about her own daughter, sick at home with an illness the doctors couldn't diagnose. She thought about how fragile life was, how quickly everything could change. And she thought about the little girl in seat 47B who had so earnestly offered to help with her daughter's case, a 9-year-old child who had no idea that she was about to do something that would shock every medical professional on this aircraft. Because Amara Njoku had been listening. She had been listening to the desperate voices carrying from first class, to the scattered pieces of information that filtered through the worried whispers of passengers. She had heard them say seizure, heard them say pupils dilated, heard them say antimalarial medication and herbal supplement and tropical illness. And in her mind, in that extraordinary photographic memory that had absorbed thousands of pages of her mother's medical research, pieces were falling into place. She knew what was wrong. She knew exactly what was wrong with the woman in first class. And if someone didn't listen to her in the next few minutes, that woman was going to die. If you're wondering what a 9-year-old girl could possibly know that 3 experienced doctors didn't, stay tuned because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. Make sure you're subscribed because you won't believe how this story unfolds. What would you do if you knew the answer to saving someone's life, but you were certain no one would listen to you because of your age? Drop your thoughts in the comments because Amara was about to face exactly that impossible choice. Amara Njoku sat frozen in seat 47B, her small hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Around her, passengers whispered in worried tones, sharing fragmented information, spreading rumors about what was happening in first class. Someone was dying. The doctors couldn't save her. It was hopeless. The plane was making an emergency landing, but everyone knew, in that unspoken way that fear communicates, that they wouldn't make it in time. But Amara wasn't listening to the rumors. She was listening to the symptoms. She had been listening since the moment the first scream had cut through the cabin, her mind automatically cataloging every piece of medical information that had filtered back through the rows of seats. Seizure. Dilated pupils. Unresponsive. Antimalarial medication. Herbal supplement. The words circled in her photographic memory, connecting to passages she had read in her mother's notebooks, to research her mother had conducted on drug interactions in tropical medicine. And then, like a key turning in a lock, everything clicked into place. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, a passage from the second notebook, the one with the brown leather cover that was worn soft from Amara's constant handling. Dr. Chioma Njoku had spent 3 years researching the dangerous interactions between traditional herbal remedies and modern pharmaceuticals, particularly in West Africa where both were commonly used simultaneously. She had documented case after case of patients who had suffered severe reactions, even death, because no one had understood that mixing certain natural compounds with certain medications could create a toxic chemical reaction in the bloodstream. Amara could see the page in her mind as clearly as if it were open in front of her. Page 47 of the second notebook. Her mother's precise handwriting describing synchronism, a condition caused by quinine toxicity. The symptoms: severe headache, tinnitus, visual disturbances, confusion, slurred speech, seizures, cardiovascular collapse. The causes: overdose of quinine-based antimalarial medications, or more commonly, the interaction between antimalarials and natural supplements containing cinchona alkaloids. The treatment protocol, carefully detailed, step by step. The woman in first class had every single symptom. Every single one. And the doctors were treating it like a stroke or a brain aneurysm, which meant they were missing the actual cause, which meant their treatments wouldn't work, which meant the woman was going to die. Amara knew what was wrong. She knew exactly what was wrong. And more importantly, she knew how to fix it. But she was 9 years old, sitting in economy class, and the chances of anyone listening to her were almost zero. She could stay in her seat, stay quiet, stay safe in the knowledge that at least she had tried to help Sandra's daughter earlier, that she was a good person who cared. The woman in first class had doctors, 3 of them, all with years of training and experience. Surely they would figure it out. Surely it wasn't her responsibility. Except it was. Because her mother had taught her that knowledge was only valuable if you used it to help people. Knowledge without action was just information taking up space in your head. Her mother had died trying to save people, had spent her last conscious moments making Amara promise to continue her work. And now, on this airplane, 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, that promise was being tested in a way Amara had never imagined. She unbuckled her seatbelt with trembling fingers. The businessman in the aisle seat didn't even notice as she stood up, too engrossed in trying to film what was happening up front with his phone. Amara stepped into the aisle, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She was terrified. Not of being wrong, she knew she was right, but of being dismissed, of being sent back to her seat while the woman died, and Amara lived the rest of her life knowing she could have saved her but hadn't been brave enough to push harder. She started walking toward first class. Other passengers noticed her, a small child moving toward the front of the plane during a medical emergency. A woman reached out to stop her, telling her gently that she needed to stay in her seat. Amara politely but firmly moved past her. A man asked if she was looking for the bathroom, pointing toward the lavatories at the back. Amara shook her head and kept walking. The crowd thickened as she approached the curtain separating economy from the premium cabins. Passengers had gathered there despite the flight attendant's requests to remain seated, everyone craning to see what was happening, everyone wanting to witness the drama. Amara was small enough to slip between people, ducking under reaching arms, squeezing through gaps. Someone protested as she pushed past, but she kept moving. She reached the first-class curtain and pushed through it. The scene before her was controlled chaos. 3 adults in professional clothes surrounded a woman lying unconscious in her seat, an oxygen mask over her face, for lines running from her arm. Medical equipment was scattered across empty seats. A man in an expensive suit was slumped nearby, his face in his hands, crying. And the doctors, all 3 of them, looked terrified in a way that doctors aren't supposed to look. Sandra, the flight attendant who had been so kind to Amara, was the first to notice her. She hurried over, her expression concerned but gentle. She knelt down to Amara's level, her voice soft and apologetic. "Sweetheart," she said, "you need to go back to your seat. The doctors are helping. Everything is going to be okay." She reached out to guide Amara back toward economy, her touch light on Amara's shoulder. Amara looked up at Sandra, and the words came out stronger than she felt. "Please," she said. "I know what's wrong with her." Sandra's expression shifted to sympathetic concern. She thought Amara was scared, that the little girl was trying to help in the only way a child knew how. She started to explain again that the doctors were taking care of everything, that Amara didn't need to worry. But Amara's voice cut through, louder this time. "Please. I know what's wrong with her. I can help." Dr. Patricia Mills had heard the commotion and turned to see a child standing in the aisle, a child who looked no older than her own granddaughter. She felt a flash of irritation. This was exactly what they didn't need right now, distractions and well-meaning interference. She straightened up, her voice coming out more sharply than she intended. "Little girl," she said, "this isn't the time for games. You need to go back to your seat right now." The dismissal in Dr. Mills' voice was absolute, the kind of tone that brooked no argument. She had already turned back to her patient, already dismissed Amara as irrelevant. Sandra gently tried again to guide Amara away, apologizing to the doctors for the interruption. But then Derek, Victoria's assistant, looked up from his grief. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, his face a mask of desperation. He had heard what the little girl said. He had seen the doctor's fear, had understood that they were out of options, that they were watching his boss die and couldn't stop it. And in that moment of complete helplessness, he was willing to grasp at anything, even the impossible claim of a child. "Let her speak," Derek said, his voice rough. His words hung in the air. The doctors turned to look at him like he'd lost his mind. Dr. Mills opened her mouth to argue, but Derek cut her off. "Let her speak," he repeated, stronger this time. "We're losing her anyway. What's the harm in listening?" Dr. Kowalski exchanged glances with his colleagues. This was insane. They were wasting precious seconds humoring a child's fantasy. But he saw the look in Derek's eyes, the desperate plea of a man watching someone he cared about slip away. And he also saw the little girl's face, saw that she wasn't crying or scared or seeking attention. She looked focused, determined, older than her years. "Fine," Dr. Kowalski said with a sigh that was part frustration and part exhaustion. "Make it quick." Amara stepped closer to Victoria's seat, her eyes scanning the unconscious woman with a clinical precision that would have seemed strange in an adult, much less a child. She looked at the oxygen mask, the four-line, the monitors displaying vital signs. She looked at Victoria's face, at the unnatural pallor of her skin, at the way her chest moved with rapid, shallow breaths. Then Amara started asking questions. Her voice was steady, clear, nothing like what you'd expect from a 9-year-old in a crisis situation. She asked about the symptoms before the collapse. What exactly had the patient complained of? When did the symptoms start? What medications had she taken, and when? Dr. Cho, who had been monitoring Victoria's vital signs, answered almost automatically. "Severe headache," he said. "Started about 3 hours into the flight. Light sensitivity. She was irritable more than usual. Then slurred speech and then the convulsions." He listed the medications Victoria had taken. Her regular blood pressure medication. Anti-malarial drugs, she'd been taking them for the past week for her trip to Nigeria. Some kind of herbal supplement. Amara's eyes sharpened. "What kind of herbal supplement?" She asked for the bottle. Dr. Cho handed it to her, watching this surreal scene unfold. A 9-year-old girl examining a supplement bottle while 3 doctors stood by. Amara read the label, her photographic memory cross-referencing the vague ingredient list with information from her mother's research. She saw the words, "natural energy blend," and "cinchona extract" buried in the fine print. Her suspicion solidified into certainty. She looked up at the doctors, and what came out of her mouth next made all 3 of them freeze. "She has synchronism progressing to quinine toxicity with central nervous system involvement." The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Mills actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. She started to say that's not, but Amara kept talking. "The herbal supplement contains cinchona alkaloids," Amara said, her voice taking on a lecturing quality, like she was reciting from a textbook because, in a way, she was. "When combined with the quinine-based anti-malarial medication she's been taking, it created a synergistic toxic reaction. The total quinidine load in her system exceeded the therapeutic threshold and crossed into severe toxicity. The symptoms, severe headache, photophobia, auditory disturbances, seizures, altered consciousness, dilated pupils, cardiovascular instability, are all consistent with acute synchronism." Dr. Kowalski stared at the child. The medical terminology coming from her mouth was perfect, precise, the kind of language that medical students struggled to master. This wasn't a child repeating something she'd heard on television. This was someone who actually understood what she was saying. "That's impossible," Dr. Mills said, but her voice had lost its certainty. A child couldn't know this. Couldn't diagnose this. But even as she said it, parts of her brain were processing what Amara had said, were recognizing that it actually made sense, that it explained symptoms they'd been struggling to fit into any conventional diagnosis. Amara turned to Derek. "What exactly was in the supplement?" she asked. "Who gave it to her?" Derek fumbled for the bottle, reading the label with trembling hands. He said it was from a business associate in Lagos. He said it was for energy and mental clarity. All natural. Victoria had been taking it 3 times a day for the past 4 days, exactly as he'd instructed. Amara nodded like this confirmed everything. "The supplement likely contains concentrated cinchona bark extract," she said. "It's marketed as natural, so people don't realize it contains the same active compounds as anti-malarial drugs. When you combine it with prescription anti-malarials, you're essentially overdosing on quinine. The body can't process that level of alkaloids. They accumulate in the nervous system and cardiovascular tissue. The initial symptoms, headache and irritability, were early warning signs. When those were ignored, the toxicity progressed to neurological crisis. Dr. Cho was staring at Amara with an expression of dawning recognition. He knew that explanation. He had read that explanation somewhere. The precision of the description, the specific focus on drug interactions in tropical medicine contexts, it was familiar. And then it clicked. "Are you," he started, his voice hesitant. "Are you related to Dr. Chioma Njoku?" Amara's expression flickered, a flash of grief and pride. "She was my mother," Amara said quietly. Dr. Cho's eyes widened. "Your mother published groundbreaking research on pharmaceutical interactions in West African populations. I've read her work. It was," he paused, searching for words, "it was brilliant. Revolutionary." And then he looked at Amara with new eyes, understanding flooding through him. "You've read her research?" "All of it," Amara said. "I have photographic memory. I've memorized all of her notebooks." The three doctors looked at each other, a silent conversation happening in glances and raised eyebrows. This was insane. They were considering taking medical advice from a 9-year-old child. But Dr. Cho's recognition of Dr. Njoku's work lent credibility that was hard to dismiss. And more importantly, what Amara was saying actually made medical sense. It explained everything, all the symptoms that hadn't fit any of their working diagnoses. Dr. Kowalski decided to test her. "Fine," he said, his voice still skeptical but willing to be convinced. "If you're right about the diagnosis, what's the treatment protocol?" Amara didn't hesitate. "Immediate discontinuation of all quinine-based medications. Activated charcoal if available to prevent further absorption, though we're probably past the window for that to be fully effective. Aggressive 4-fluid resuscitation with specific electrolyte supplementation, particularly potassium and magnesium, because quinine toxicity causes significant cardiac conduction abnormalities. Cardiac monitoring is critical, we need to watch for arrhythmias. Anticonvulsants to prevent further seizures, benzodiazepines would be first line. If cardiovascular collapse progresses, we may need vasopressor support," but she trailed off, looking around the airplane cabin. "Obviously we don't have that available here." She continued, her voice steady and clinical. "The key is to support her cardiovascular and respiratory function while her body metabolizes and excretes the excess quinine. Urinary alkalinization could help speed elimination, but again our options are limited. The most important thing right now is the 4 fluids and electrolyte balance. Her heart is at risk of fatal arrhythmia if we don't correct the electrolyte disturbances caused by the toxicity." Dr. Kowalski felt his skepticism crumbling. That was a perfect recitation of the treatment protocol for quinine toxicity. He had treated exactly one case in his entire career 5 years ago, and he'd had to look up the protocol in a textbook. This child had just recited it from memory with the kind of precision that would have impressed a toxicology specialist. Dr. Mills was doing calculations in her head. The timeline fit. The symptoms fit. The combination of medications fit. And their current treatments, treating her for stroke and seizure disorder, weren't addressing the underlying cause, which was why nothing was working. But Victoria's breathing was becoming more labored, even with the oxygen. Her heart rate on the monitor was showing increasingly irregular rhythms. They were running out of time to debate whether to trust a 9-year-old genius or stick with their own failing protocols. Derek made the decision for them. His voice was desperate, broken. "Please," he said. "We're losing her. You've tried everything and nothing is working. What do we have to lose by trying what she's suggesting?" Dr. Cho looked at Amara, really looked at her, saw the intelligence in those young eyes, saw the absolute certainty in her expression. Then he looked at his patient, at Victoria's deteriorating vital signs, at the monitor showing a heart rhythm that was becoming more and more unstable. He had read Dr. Chioma Njoku's research. He knew it was solid, peer-reviewed, respected in the medical community. And this child had her mother's knowledge, had memorized work that had taken years to develop. "We've tried everything else," Dr. Cho said slowly, "and this actually makes medical sense. More sense than anything we've come up with." He looked at his colleagues. "I think we should listen to her." Dr. Kowalski nodded, his professional pride taking a back seat to the reality of the situation. They were out of options. A long shot based on solid medical reasoning was better than continuing down a path that was clearly failing. Dr. Mills took a deep breath and made a decision that went against every instinct that said you don't take orders from a child. "Okay," she said. "Tell us exactly what to do." The next 15 minutes were the most intense of everyone's lives. Amara became the de facto medical director of an emergency treatment team at 35,000 feet, and she was extraordinary. She started by having them check the aircraft's emergency medical supplies. They didn't have activated charcoal as she'd suspected, but they did have 4 fluids and several types of electrolyte solutions. She had them calculate Victoria's body weight and then precisely calculated the fluid resuscitation rate they needed to achieve, factoring in her current dehydration and the need to help her kidneys flush the toxins. Dr. Cho started a second four-line under Amara's direction while Dr. Mills prepared the electrolyte supplementation. Amara specified exact concentrations, referencing ranges from memory that the doctors verified were correct using the limited reference materials they had available. She explained that too much too fast could cause its own problems, but too little wouldn't correct the cardiac conduction issues that were putting Victoria at risk of fatal arrhythmia. She had them reposition Victoria to improve her breathing, explain the exact angle that would optimize airway clearance and reduce the risk of aspiration. She monitored the portable cardiac monitor they'd attached, pointing out the specific abnormalities in the rhythm that indicated electrolyte imbalance versus the ones that indicated direct cardiac toxicity. When Victoria started showing signs of another seizure, muscles beginning to twitch, Amara immediately recognized it and had Dr. Kowalski administer a specific dose of anticonvulsant from the emergency kit. She calculated the dosage based on Victoria's estimated weight and the severity of her symptoms, and when Dr. Kowalski started to question whether it was too much for someone with cardiovascular instability, Amara explained the reasoning, cited the research showing that undertreating seizures and quinine toxicity often led to worse outcomes than the sedative effects of appropriate benzodiazepine doses. The doctors worked together, following Amara's guidance, and slowly, impossibly, Victoria's vital signs began to stabilize. Her heart rate, which had been racing erratically between 140 and 160 beats per minute, began to slow and regulate. The dangerous irregularities in her rhythm started to smooth out as the electrolyte balance corrected. Her blood pressure, which had been dangerously elevated, began to come down to safer ranges. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, deepened and slowed as her body's stress response began to calm. The oxygen saturation that had been hovering in the dangerous 80s climbed back up to 92%, then 94, then 96. It was working. Against all odds, against all logic, the treatment protocol that a 9-year-old girl had prescribed from memory was actually working. Dr. Mills checked Victoria's pupils. They were still dilated but no longer fixed. There was a slight response to light now, a sluggish constriction that suggested neurological function was beginning to recover. She looked at Amara with an expression that was equal parts awe and disbelief. Dr. Kowalski monitored the cardiac rhythm, watching the dangerous patterns smooth into something closer to normal sinus rhythm. He had been certain they were going to have to perform CPR before they landed, had been mentally preparing for the almost certain failure of resuscitation in these conditions. Now he was watching a patient stabilize, watching vital signs improve in real time, all because they'd listened to a child. Dr. Cho adjusted the 4-drip rate exactly as Amara specified, maintaining the precise fluid balance she'd calculated. He kept glancing at her, this small girl who spoke with the authority of a medical textbook, who understood pharmacokinetics and toxicology in ways that would challenge most physicians. He thought about her mother, about Dr. Amara Njoku's dedication to saving lives, and saw that same fierce commitment burning in her daughter's eyes. Amara stood beside Victoria's seat, watching the monitors with intense concentration, ready to adjust the treatment if anything changed. She explained to the doctors what they should watch for over the next hour, what signs would indicate improvement versus complications. She was calm, focused, completely in control in a way that made the adults around her forget they were taking instructions from someone who still had baby teeth. Derek watched all of this through tears, but now they were tears of relief rather than grief. Victoria's color was improving, the grayish pallor giving way to something closer to natural skin tone. She was still unconscious, still critically ill, but she was alive. She was going to live. This little girl had saved her. Sandra stood at the edge of the scene, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She thought about earlier, when Amara had offered to help with her daughter's case, how she'd smiled but hadn't taken the child seriously. She thought about how close they'd all come to dismissing Amara completely, to sending her back to her seat while a woman died from something she could have diagnosed and treated. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing they were beginning their descent for the emergency landing, still about 40 minutes out. But the urgency in his voice had lessened. The cabin crew had relayed that the patient had stabilized, that the immediate crisis had passed. 40 minutes. Victoria's vitals held steady, her body responding to the treatment, beginning the slow process of metabolizing and eliminating the toxins that had nearly killed her. The doctors maintained the careful monitoring and treatment protocol that Amara had established, no longer questioning, just following her guidance. And Amara stood there, a 9-year-old girl who had just done something that would seem impossible if dozens of witnesses weren't there to confirm it happened. She had diagnosed a condition that 3 experienced doctors had missed. She had prescribed a treatment protocol from memory that was saving a woman's life. She had proven that brilliance and knowledge transcend age, that being underestimated doesn't mean being wrong, and that sometimes the most unlikely person in the room is exactly the one who has the answer everyone else was missing. If you think this story is incredible, just wait until you see what happens when Victoria wakes up and realizes who saved her life. Subscribe now because the next part of this journey will show you that sometimes the people we dismiss are the ones who change everything. Do you think the doctors did the right thing by listening to Amara, or should they have stuck with their own medical judgment? Let me know in the comments because this decision literally meant the difference between life and death. The change was subtle at first, so subtle that if you weren't watching the monitors as closely as the doctors were, you might have missed it. But Dr. Kowalski saw it. Victoria's heart rate, which had been jumping erratically between dangerous extremes, held steady at 108 beats per minute for 10 consecutive seconds. Then 20. Then 30. The chaotic rhythm that had threatened to spiral into cardiac arrest was smoothing out, finding its natural cadence again. Dr. Mills watched the oxygen saturation climb. 96%. 97. 98. Numbers that 20 minutes ago had seemed impossibly out of reach were now appearing on the screen in steady green digits. Victoria's breathing, which had been the rapid, shallow gasping of a body in crisis, was deepening, slowing, becoming the regular rise and fall of someone sleeping rather than dying. Dr. Cho checked her blood pressure for what felt like the 100th time, and his eyes widened. 140/85. Still elevated, but coming down from the dangerous spike that had threatened to cause a stroke. He checked again, certain he'd made an error, but the reading was consistent. Her body was responding. The treatment was working. The convulsions that had racked Victoria's body with such violence that they'd had to hold her down to prevent injury were slowing. The rigid muscle contractions that had contorted her limbs into unnatural positions were releasing. Her hands, which had been clenched into claws, gradually relaxed. Her jaw, locked tight enough that they'd worried about her biting through her tongue, loosened. The tremors that had shaken her entire frame diminished from violent shaking to occasional twitches, and then, miraculously, stopped altogether. Victoria lay still in her seat, no longer convulsing, no longer dying. Just still. Breathing. Alive. Dr. Kowalski looked at Amara with an expression that combined awe, gratitude, and the humbling realization that he had almost sent this child away. He had almost dismissed the person who had the answer they desperately needed. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with emotion. "You were right," he said simply. "About all of it." Dr. Mills was checking Victoria's pupils again, and what she saw made her breath catch. The left pupil, which had been blown wide and completely unresponsive, was beginning to constrict. Slowly, sluggishly, but it was responding to light. That meant the pressure on her brain was releasing, that the toxicity affecting her central nervous system was being reversed. That meant neurological function was returning. "She's coming back," Dr. Mills said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's actually coming back." Amara stood beside the doctors, her young face still focused and alert, watching the monitors, ready to adjust the treatment if needed. But there was also something else in her expression now, a slight easing of the tension that had held her rigid during the crisis. Relief. It was working. The protocol her mother had developed, the research that Dr. Amara Njoku had poured her life into, was saving a life right here, right now, in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. Dr. Cho maintained the 4-drip exactly as Amara had specified, watching the fluids flow into Victoria's veins, carrying the electrolytes that were correcting the dangerous imbalances in her system. He kept glancing between the 4-bag and the cardiac monitor, seeing in real time how the treatment was pulling a woman back from the edge of death. In his 30 years of practicing medicine, he had never witnessed anything quite like this. And then, approximately 18 minutes after they had begun following Amara's protocol, Victoria's eyelids fluttered. It was the smallest movement, barely perceptible, but Derek saw it. He had been sitting nearby, watching his boss with the desperate hope of someone who had already started grieving and wasn't ready to believe that hope was possible. When he saw her eyelids move, he leaned forward so quickly he nearly fell out of his seat. "Victoria," he said, his voice breaking. "Victoria, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered again and then slowly, with obvious effort, they opened. Her eyes were unfocused, confused, the pupils still dilated but no longer fixed. She blinked several times, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The oxygen mask over her face. The 4 lines in her arms. The faces of strangers hovering over her. Derek's tear-streaked face. Nothing made sense. Where was she? What had happened? She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice barely a rasp. The oxygen mask muffled the sound. Dr. Mills gently adjusted the mask, giving Victoria more room to speak while still maintaining the oxygen flow. Take it slow, Dr. Mills said, her voice gentle. You've been very sick. You're on a plane. You're safe now. Victoria's confusion was palpable. A plane? She tried to remember. Lagos. The business meeting. Flying home. And then nothing. Just fragments. Pain. Fear. Darkness. Her body felt heavy, disconnected, like it belonged to someone else. Every movement took enormous effort. What happened? Victoria managed to whisper. The words were slurred, her tongue thick in her mouth, but they were understandable. You had a severe reaction to medication, Dr. Cho explained, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. You went into convulsions. Your heart was failing. But you're going to be okay now. The treatment is working. Victoria tried to process this information, but her mind felt foggy, thoughts moving like they were pushing through thick mud. She had been dying. She understood that much. The fear she'd felt before losing consciousness that had been real. She had been dying and somehow she wasn't anymore. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, cutting through the hushed intensity of first class. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'm pleased to report that our medical emergency has stabilized. The passenger is conscious and responding to treatment. We're still proceeding with our emergency landing at London Heathrow as a precaution, where medical personnel will be standing by. We'll be on the ground in approximately 35 minutes. I want to thank everyone for your patience and cooperation during this difficult situation. The cabin erupted in applause. It started in first class, the passengers who had been close enough to witness the drama, who had seen the doctor's fear and the little girl's intervention. Then it spread backward through the plane as the news traveled, 247 people clapping and cheering for a woman most of them had never met, celebrating the simple fact that a life had been saved. Sandra, who had been standing near the galley with tears streaming down her face, moved quickly to Amara. She dropped to her knees and pulled the little girl into a tight embrace, not caring about professional boundaries or appropriate flight attendant conduct. This child had just saved a woman's life. This child, who she had smiled at patronizingly when Amara offered to help with her daughter's case, had proven to be brilliant beyond anything Sandra had imagined. Thank you, Sandra whispered into Amara's hair. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Amara, overwhelmed by the emotion and the physical contact and the release of the tension she'd been holding, hugged Sandra back and finally let herself be 9 years old again. Her small body shook with the aftermath of adrenaline, the weight of what she'd just done settling onto her shoulders. Dr. Mills approached them, waiting until Sandra released Amara from the embrace. The cardiologist knelt down to Amara's eye level, and her expression was a mixture of humility and respect. I need to say something to you, Dr. Mills began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. When you tried to help, I dismissed you. I was condescending and rude. I treated you like you were in the way instead of listening to what you had to say. She paused, making sure Amara was looking directly at her. I was wrong. Completely wrong. And I'm sorry. You saved that woman's life, and if I had my way, you wouldn't have even been allowed to try. I underestimated you, and I'm so very sorry. Amara looked at this accomplished doctor, this woman who had probably spent decades being respected and listened to, and saw genuine remorse and genuine respect in her eyes. It's okay, Amara said quietly. My mama told me that people would doubt me because I'm young. She said the important thing wasn't whether people believed me right away. It was whether I believed in myself enough to keep trying to help anyway. Dr. Mills felt tears prick at her eyes. Your mother was clearly a remarkable woman, she said. And she raised a remarkable daughter. Dr. Kowalski joined them, and he too wanted to acknowledge what Amara had done. In 20 years of emergency medicine, he said, I've never seen anything like what you just did. The knowledge, the composure, the precision. You're extraordinary. He shook his head in amazement. When you're ready to go to medical school, and I have no doubt you will be, I want you to call me. I'll write you a recommendation that will get you into any program in the country. Amara didn't quite know what to say to that. She just nodded, still processing everything that had happened in the past 20 minutes. She had saved a life. She had actually saved a life. Her mother's research, her mother's legacy, had saved a life. The thought filled her with a bittersweet mixture of pride and grief. She wished so desperately that her mother could be here to see this, to know that her work mattered, that it was still saving people even after she was gone. Derek had moved to Victoria's side, holding her hand gently. She was more alert now, though still weak and confused. She kept asking what had happened, and Derek patiently explained again and again, his voice shaking with relief. Sandra guided Amara to an empty seat near Victoria, and the little girl sat down, suddenly feeling exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis was draining away, leaving her feeling hollow and shaky. Victoria turned her head slowly, the movement obviously taking effort, and saw Amara for the first time. She saw a small child, couldn't be more than 9 or 10 years old, sitting in a first-class seat with her legs not quite reaching the floor. The child looked tired, her eyes carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "Who are you?" Victoria asked, her voice still weak and raspy. Amara looked at the woman she'd just saved, this stranger who she'd fought so hard to help. "I'm Amara," she said. "Amara Njoku." Victoria's foggy mind tried to make connections. That name sounded familiar somehow, but she couldn't place it. Derek leaned in close, explaining gently. "She's the one who saved you," he said. "When the doctors didn't know what was wrong, she figured it out. She told them how to treat you." Victoria stared at Amara, trying to comprehend what she was hearing. This child had saved her life? This little girl had diagnosed something that 3 trained physicians had missed? It seemed impossible, but the doctors were nodding, confirming Derek's words. "You saved my life?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying a note of wonder and disbelief. "Yes, ma'am," Amara said politely. Victoria was silent for a long moment, just looking at Amara, trying to understand. Finally, she asked the question that was burning in her mind. Why did you help me?" It was a simple question, but it carried weight. Victoria knew how she appeared to people, knew her reputation for coldness and demanding perfection. She knew that most people found her difficult, that she didn't inspire affection or loyalty beyond what money could buy. This child didn't know her, owed her nothing, could have stayed safely in her seat and let the adults handle it. Why had she risked being dismissed and humiliated to push forward and help? Amara thought about how to answer, thought about her mother and the lessons she'd taught, the values she'd instilled. "My mama always said that knowledge is only useful if you use it to help people," Amara said, her voice soft but clear. "She couldn't save everyone, but she taught me how to try. When I heard what was happening, I knew what was wrong. And if I knew and didn't help, then what was the point of knowing?" The simplicity and profound truth of that statement hit Victoria like a physical blow. Knowledge without action was meaningless. This 9-year-old child understood something that Victoria had spent decades forgetting, that success and wealth and power meant nothing if you didn't use them to make a difference in the world beyond yourself. Victoria felt tears begin to slide down her face, the first tears she'd allowed herself to cry in years. The toxins clearing from her system, the brush with death, the kindness of this child, it all combined to crack through the armor she'd built around her heart. She thought about her daughter Clara, who had begged her mother to see beyond the boardroom, to remember what mattered. She thought about how she'd dismissed Clara's concerns, how she'd chosen work over relationship, how she'd let 3 years pass without speaking to her own child. "I have a daughter," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "About your age when I stopped really seeing her. She grew up and I missed it because I was too busy building an empire. She tried to tell me that I was losing what mattered and I was too proud to listen. We haven't spoken in 3 years." Amara listened, her young face thoughtful. "Why not?" she asked simply. "Because I was too stubborn to admit I was wrong," Victoria said. "Because I kept telling myself that I'd reach out later, when the next quarter was finished, when the next deal was closed, when things calmed down at work. But things never calmed down. I always found a reason to wait. And now it's been so long that I don't know how to fix it." Amara looked at this powerful woman, this billionaire who ran a pharmaceutical empire, and saw something she recognized. Loneliness. Regret. The same grief that Amara carried every day, but different because Victoria's daughter was still alive, still reachable. "It's not too late," Amara said, her voice gentle but firm. "My mama died and I'd give anything for one more conversation. Anything in the world. You still can. Your daughter is still there. You can still call her." The words landed with the force of revelation. Victoria had been so focused on her pride, on the difficulty of admitting she'd been wrong, that she'd lost sight of the simple fact that it was still possible to fix this. Clara was alive. Victoria was alive, barely, miraculously, thanks to this child. Second chances didn't come often, and they certainly didn't come with clearer signs than nearly dying and being saved by a 9-year-old girl who understood loss in a way Victoria was only beginning to grasp. "You're right," Victoria whispered. "You're absolutely right." In that moment, sitting in adjacent seats on an airplane that was descending toward an emergency landing, a connection formed between 2 people who should never have met. A billionaire pharmaceutical CEO and a 9-year-old girl from Lagos. One who had everything money could buy but had lost what mattered. One who had lost everything that mattered but held on to the knowledge and values her mother had left behind. They were from different worlds, different generations, different continents. But in the aftermath of a near-death experience, in the shared understanding of what it meant to lose someone you loved, they found common ground. Victoria reached out with a trembling hand and Amara took it. The woman's grip was weak, but it was there, a physical connection that represented something deeper. Gratitude. Respect. The beginning of something that might, in time, become friendship. Thank you, Victoria said again, meaning so much more than just thanks for saving her life. Thank you for the reminder of what mattered. Thank you for the wisdom that came from a place of genuine loss and genuine love. Thank you for being brave enough to push forward when everyone was trying to dismiss you. The plane began its final descent into London Heathrow. The pilots had been in constant communication with ground control, and the airport had mobilized their emergency response protocols. Fire trucks and ambulances were standing by, ready for any scenario. The media had somehow gotten word of the medical emergency, and news helicopters hovered at a distance, cameras pointed at the incoming aircraft. Dr. Cho continued monitoring Victoria's vital signs during the descent, pleased to see that they remained stable. The treatment was holding. Her body was recovering. She would need hospitalization, probably several days of monitoring and continued treatment to fully clear the toxins from her system, but she was going to survive. Dr. Mills and Dr. Kowalski had moved back to their seats for landing, but both kept looking back at Amara with expressions of wonder. They would be telling this story for the rest of their careers. The day they were shown up by a 9-year-old girl. The day they learned that expertise could come from the most unexpected sources. The day they almost let their assumptions and biases cost a woman her life. Sandra had buckled Amara into the seat next to Victoria, making sure she was secure for landing. She squeezed the little girl's shoulder, wordlessly conveying her gratitude and admiration. Then she moved through the cabin, preparing everyone else for arrival, her mind still reeling from what she'd witnessed. The landing was smooth, professionally executed despite the emergency circumstances. The moment the wheels touched the tarmac, passengers could see the emergency vehicles racing alongside the plane, lights flashing. The aircraft taxied to a remote stand, away from the normal gates, where a swarm of paramedics and emergency personnel waited. The cabin doors opened and a team of paramedics boarded with a stretcher and advanced medical equipment. They moved quickly to first class, where Dr. Cho briefed them on Victoria's condition, the treatment they'd administered, and her current status. The paramedics were professional and efficient, transferring Victoria from her seat to the stretcher with practiced ease. Victoria, still weak but conscious, kept her eyes on Amara as they prepared to take her off the plane. "Don't let me lose track of you," she told Derek urgently. "Get her information. I need to thank her properly. I need to find her." Derek, who had been glued to Victoria's side throughout the entire ordeal, nodded quickly. He approached Amara, who was gathering her backpack, preparing to continue her journey to New York. He asked for her contact information, for her aunt's details in New York, for anything that would allow them to find her again. Amara recited her Aunt Blessing's phone number and address, which Derek typed frantically into his phone. He thanked her repeatedly, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me my boss back," he said. "More than that, you gave me my friend back. I don't know how to thank you." "You just did," Amara said simply. The paramedics wheeled Victoria toward the aircraft door, and as they passed Amara, Victoria reached out. Amara took her hand one more time. "Call your daughter," Amara reminded her gently. "I will," Victoria promised. "Today. As soon as I'm able." And then she was gone, wheeled off the plane and into the waiting ambulance, surrounded by medical personnel who would continue the treatment that Amara had begun. The other passengers were held on the plane while Victoria was evacuated, standard procedure for medical emergencies. They watched through the windows as the ambulance raced away, lights and sirens blazing. And then, spontaneously, applause broke out again. This time, passengers in economy who had pieced together what happened turned to look at Amara, and the applause was clearly for her. Amara felt her face flush with embarrassment and pride. She wasn't used to attention, wasn't comfortable being the center of focus. But she accepted the recognition with quiet grace, the same grace her mother had shown when people praised her research. Outside the plane, the media presence was growing. News vans from every major British network were arriving at the airport, along with international press. The story was already breaking online, social media posts from passengers spreading like wildfire. A billionaire nearly dies on a plane. Saved by a 9-year-old girl. It had all the elements of a viral story, and within hours, it would be international news. Airport officials boarded the plane to manage the situation, working with the airline to figure out logistics. Some passengers would continue to New York on this aircraft once it was cleared. Others would be rebooked on different flights. Amara, as an unaccompanied minor, was given special attention, with airline personnel ensuring she would make it safely to her final destination. But as Amara sat in that first-class seat, waiting for instructions on what to do next, she wasn't thinking about the media attention or the recognition coming her way. She was thinking about her mother. About how proud Dr. Chioma Njoku would have been to see her research save a life. About how all those hours spent memorizing notebooks had led to this moment. About how her mother's legacy was alive and continuing through her. She pulled out her phone and took a picture of her mother's notebook, the page that described the exact condition she'd just diagnosed and treated. She wanted to remember this moment, this proof that her mother's work mattered, that the promise she'd made at her mother's deathbed was a promise worth keeping. In a London hospital, Victoria Ashford was being rushed into emergency care, where doctors would marvel at the treatment protocol that had been started on the airplane, at how precisely correct it had been, at how it had saved her life. And as soon as she was stable enough to use a phone, she would make the call she should have made 3 years ago, reaching out to her daughter, ready to finally admit that she'd been wrong about what mattered most. And on the plane, Amara Njoku sat with her backpack full of her mother's notebooks, a 9-year-old girl who had just changed multiple lives, who had proven that genius knows no age limit, who had shown that the most unlikely person in the room might be exactly the one with the answer everyone needs. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Because what happened in the next few days would transform Amara's life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine, would bring recognition and opportunity and challenges that would test everything her mother had taught her about staying true to yourself when the world suddenly wants a piece of you. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens when Victoria recovers and the media discovers Amara's story will absolutely blow your mind. This 9-year-old is about to become one of the most famous children in the world, and the journey ahead will show you that sometimes, saving one life creates ripples that change everything. Have you ever had a moment where you knew you were right but everyone around you was telling you to stay quiet? What did you do? Let me know in the comments because Amara's decision to speak up, even when dismissed, literally saved a life and is about to change the world. The first video hit social media 47 minutes after the plane landed at Heathrow. A passenger in business class had filmed the moment when Amara pushed through the crowd toward first class, had captured the audio of her diagnosing Victoria's condition with medical precision that seemed impossible coming from a child. The passenger, a tech entrepreneur from Silicon Valley, posted it to his account with the caption, "Just watched a 9-year-old girl save a billionaire's life on my flight. 3 doctors couldn't figure it out. She did. This is the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed." Within an hour the video had 10,000 views. Within 2 hours 100,000. By the time Amara's connecting flight to New York took off from Heathrow, the video had been viewed over 2 million times and had been picked up by news aggregators around the world. The media moved with the relentless speed that only a perfect story can generate. A child genius. A dying billionaire. A dramatic rescue at 35,000 feet. It had everything that audiences craved: human interest, medical drama, the underdog triumphing against dismissive adults, and a happy ending that felt almost too good to be true. CNN was the first major network to run the story, interrupting their regular programming with breaking news. Their medical correspondent, a physician himself, analyzed the video and confirmed that the diagnosis of quinine toxicity was not only correct but represented a level of medical sophistication that would challenge most practicing physicians. He explained to viewers what synchronism was, how rare it was to diagnose correctly, and how the specific combination of symptoms could easily be mistaken for stroke or seizure disorder. The child in the video, he said with barely concealed amazement, had made a diagnosis that required understanding of pharmacology, toxicology, and clinical medicine at a level that medical students spent years trying to master. BBC picked up the story next, identifying Victoria Ashford as the patient and adding context about her prominence in the pharmaceutical industry. The irony wasn't lost on commentators. A pharmaceutical billionaire saved by a child using research that pharmaceutical companies had largely ignored because it focused on diseases affecting poor populations. The story had layers that news analysts could discuss for hours. Social media exploded with reactions. The hashtag 9-year-old genius began trending worldwide. People shared the video, adding their own commentary. Some praised Amara's brilliance and courage. Others questioned whether the story was real, whether it was some kind of publicity stunt, though the multiple passenger testimonials and the official airline statement confirming the medical emergency made such skepticism hard to maintain. Medical professionals weighed in from around the globe. A toxicologist from Johns Hopkins posted a detailed thread explaining exactly why Amara's diagnosis was correct and how impressive it was that she'd identified it so quickly. A pediatric neurologist from Stanford commented that this was a clear example of how intelligence manifests regardless of age, and that the medical community needed to be more open to recognizing expertise in unconventional sources. An emergency medicine physician from London who had actually treated Victoria after she arrived at the hospital, confirmed that the treatment protocol initiated on the airplane had been textbook perfect and had absolutely saved the patient's life. The story spread beyond medical circles into broader cultural conversations. Education experts discussed photographic memory in gifted children. African news outlets ran features about Dr. Chioma Njoku's research and her daughter carrying on her legacy. Feminist commentators analyzed the dismissiveness that Amara had faced from the doctors, drawing parallels to how women and girls are often not taken seriously in scientific fields. The story became a Rorschach test, with everyone seeing in it confirmation of whatever they already believed about education, expertise, race, gender, age, and authority. In Lagos, Nigeria, Kwame Njoku was at work in his garage, covered in grease from the engine he was rebuilding, when his neighbor ran in shouting that his daughter was on the news. On the news? Kwame wiped his hands and followed his neighbor to a small television in the garage office, where a cluster of workers had gathered. What he saw made his heart stop. Video of his daughter on an airplane, surrounded by adults, speaking with authority about medical conditions. News anchors describing how she'd saved a billionaire's life. The words 9-year-old genius, scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Kwame's hands started shaking. His daughter had been in danger. There had been an emergency. She'd been on a plane where someone nearly died. And he hadn't known. Hadn't been there to protect her. The fact that she'd been the hero of the story didn't erase the terror he felt at the realization of how serious the situation had been. He frantically called the airline, demanding to speak to someone who could tell him where his daughter was, if she was safe, what had happened. The airline representative, overwhelmed by the media attention the story was generating, confirmed that Amara had continued to New York as planned, that she was safe, and that she had acted with incredible bravery and intelligence. They offered to connect him with his sister, Aunt Blessing, who was meeting Amara at JFK Airport. When Kwame finally got through to his sister, he could barely speak through his tears. Blessing assured him that she'd been watching the news, that she knew what happened, that she was at the airport right now waiting for Amara's flight to land. She told him that their little girl had done something extraordinary, something that would change her life. Kwame asked Blessing to tell Amara that he loved her, that he was so proud he could barely breathe, and that he needed to talk to her the moment she landed. The medical community's response grew more substantive as experts had time to analyze what had happened. The American Medical Association released a statement praising Amara's diagnostic acumen while also noting that the case highlighted important issues about medication interactions and the need for better tracking of herbal supplements. The World Health Organization's Tropical Medicine Division commented on Dr. Chioma Njoku's research, noting that her work on drug interactions had been ahead of its time and deserved more attention and funding. Victoria Ashford, lying in a hospital bed in London, watched the news coverage on the television mounted to her wall. She was fully conscious now, clear-headed for the first time in days, though still weak. The doctors had told her multiple times that she'd been incredibly lucky, that if treatment had been delayed even another 10 minutes, she likely would have suffered permanent brain damage or death. They marveled at the protocol that had been initiated on the airplane, asking who the attending physician had been. When Victoria explained that it had been a 9-year-old girl, not a physician at all, the doctors had initially assumed she was confused, that the toxins had affected her memory. But Derek corroborated the story, showed them the videos that were now circulating online, and the medical team stood in stunned silence watching this child diagnose and treat a condition that they themselves wouldn't have immediately recognized. Victoria's private room in the hospital had become a fortress of security, with guards posted outside to keep away the press that had descended on the facility. She'd been fielding calls from her company's board of directors, from business associates, from people she hadn't spoken to in years, everyone wanting to know if the story was true, if she was all right, what had happened. But the call she was waiting for hadn't come. Clara, her daughter, hadn't reached out. Victoria had been checking her phone obsessively, hoping to see her daughter's name appear on the screen, but there was nothing. 3 years of silence couldn't be undone by a news story, apparently. The realization hurt more than Victoria had expected, a pain that had nothing to do with the residual effects of the toxins in her system. And then, on the second day of her hospital stay, there was a commotion outside her room. Raised voices. Someone arguing with security. Victoria heard a voice she hadn't heard in 3 years, a voice that made her heart clench with longing and regret. Clara had come. The door opened and Victoria's daughter stood there, her face blotchy from crying, her eyes red and swollen. She looked exactly as Victoria remembered and completely different at the same time. 26 now, no longer the 23-year-old who had walked out of her mother's life after their final argument. Older. Maybe wiser. Definitely hurt. For a long moment, mother and daughter just stared at each other across the hospital room, 3 years of silence filling the space between them. Clara's hands were shaking. Victoria's eyes were filling with tears. I saw the news, Clara said finally, her voice breaking. I saw that you almost died. Victoria tried to speak, but her throat closed around the words. She just nodded. Clara took a step into the room, then another. I kept telling myself I didn't care anymore, she said. That you'd made your choices and I'd made mine. That I was fine with us not speaking. But then I saw that video, saw you unconscious on that plane, and I realized that you could have died. You could have died, and the last words I ever said to you were that I never wanted to see you again. The dam broke, and Clara crossed the remaining distance to her mother's bedside in 3 quick steps. She grabbed Victoria's hand, the same hand that had held Amara's on the plane, and held it like she was afraid to let go. I'm sorry, Victoria whispered, the words she should have said 3 years ago finally breaking free. I'm so sorry. You were right about everything. About my priorities. About what matters. About all of it. I was too proud and too stubborn to admit it, and I let 3 years go by without talking to my own daughter. Clara was crying openly now. I missed you, she said. I was so angry at you, but I missed you every single day. Victoria pulled her daughter into an embrace, awkward because of the 4 lines and monitoring equipment, but fierce nonetheless. I almost died without fixing this, she said. A 9-year-old child had to save my life before I understood what you'd been trying to tell me. How did I get so lost? They held each other and cried, releasing 3 years of hurt and loneliness and stubborn pride. Derek, watching from the doorway with tears streaming down his own face, quietly backed out of the room to give them privacy. Some moments were too sacred for witnesses. Over the next hour, mother and daughter talked in a way they hadn't in years. Really talked. Victoria told Clara about the plane, about the terror of feeling her body shut down, about the little girl who had refused to give up even when everyone dismissed her. Clara told her mother about the 3 years they'd lost, about the milestones Victoria had missed, about how hard it had been to cut off contact but how much harder it had been to maintain. Clara asked about Amara, wanted to know everything about the child who had saved her mother's life. Victoria realized she didn't know very much. A 9-year-old girl from Nigeria traveling alone to New York. Daughter of a deceased medical researcher. Brilliant beyond measure. But Victoria didn't know where she lived, didn't know her circumstances, didn't know if she'd ever see her again to properly thank her. Derek, called back into the room, assured Victoria that he had Amara's contact information, her aunt's address in New York. They would find her. They would thank her properly. Victoria had already made a decision, lying in that hospital bed, watching the news coverage of the girl who saved her life. She was going to do something meaningful. Something that would honor both Amara and her mother's memory. She just needed to get well enough to do it. 1 week later, Amara stood at the window of her Aunt Blessing's apartment in the Bronx, watching the street below. It was a small apartment, clean but cramped, in a building that had seen better decades. Aunt Blessing worked 2 jobs to afford even this modest space, and having Amara stay for the summer meant an extra mouth to feed on a budget that was already stretched thin. The past week had been surreal. Amara couldn't walk down the street without being recognized. People stopped her to take photos, to tell her how amazing she was, to ask how it felt to be a hero. News crews had camped outside the apartment building for the first 3 days until Aunt Blessing, protective and fierce, had threatened to call the police if they didn't leave the child alone. Amara's phone, a basic model that her father had given her before the trip, had been overwhelmed with messages and calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters requesting interviews. Talk shows inviting her to appear. Strangers sending congratulations and, weirdly, some sending criticism and skepticism. Aunt Blessing had eventually just turned the phone off, telling Amara that she didn't need to deal with all of that noise. But the one call that came through every single day at exactly 8 p.m. New York time, which was 2 a.m. in Lagos, was from her father. Kwame called religiously, needing to hear his daughter's voice, needing confirmation that she was really okay. They talked for hours, Amara describing everything that had happened, Kwame telling her over and over how proud he was, how her mother would have been so proud, how she'd honored Dr. Chioma Njoku's legacy in the most incredible way. Amara missed her mother with an intensity that sometimes made it hard to breathe. She wanted to tell her about the plane, about saving Victoria's life, about how the research had worked exactly as described in the notebooks. She wanted to see her mother's face light up with pride. She wanted to hear her mother explain the parts she didn't fully understand, to expand on the knowledge that Amara had memorized but didn't always comprehend at the deepest level. At night, alone in the small room that Aunt Blessing had cleared out for her, Amara pulled out her mother's notebooks and read them again, running her fingers over the familiar handwriting, feeling close to Dr. Chioma Njoku in the only way she still could. The recognition was nice. People calling her brilliant and brave and amazing. But it also felt hollow because the one person whose recognition would have mattered most wasn't there to give it. Amara was 9 years old and already understood a truth that many adults never grasp. That success without someone to share it with is just a lonely kind of achievement. On a Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the plane landing, there was a knock on the apartment door. Aunt Blessing answered it, and her eyes went wide. Standing in the hallway, looking somewhat out of place in the rundown building, were Victoria Ashford and Derek, along with 2 security personnel who had positioned themselves discreetly nearby. Aunt Blessing recognized Victoria immediately from the news coverage. She invited them in, flustered and apologetic about the state of the apartment, quickly trying to tidy up even though the space was already clean. Victoria assured her that everything was fine, that they were just grateful she was willing to see them. Amara came out from her room, curious about the visitors, and stopped dead when she saw Victoria. The woman looked completely different than she had on the plane. Healthy, strong, put together. Elegant, inexpensive clothes that probably cost more than 6 months of Aunt Blessing's rent. But her eyes were kind, and when she saw Amara, she smiled with genuine warmth. "Hello, Amara," Victoria said softly. "I needed to come thank you properly." They sat in Aunt Blessing's small living room, Victoria and Derek on the worn couch, Amara and her aunt on folding chairs brought from the kitchen. For a few moments no one quite knew what to say. The gulf between Victoria's world and Amara's world was visible in every detail of the apartment, in the contrast between Victoria's designer clothes and Aunt Blessing's work uniform, in the security detail waiting outside and the peeling paint on the walls inside. But then Victoria started talking and the gulf began to narrow. She told Amara about her recovery, about how the doctors had confirmed that without the treatment Amara had prescribed, Victoria would have died or suffered permanent brain damage. She told her about Clara, about the reconciliation that Amara's words on the plane had inspired, about how mother and daughter were rebuilding their relationship day by day. "You didn't just save my life," Victoria said. "You saved my family. You gave me a second chance to fix the most important thing I'd broken." Amara listened, pleased that something good had come from the crisis beyond just Victoria's survival. She asked about Clara, wanted to know if they were doing okay. Victoria's face lit up as she talked about her daughter, and Amara could see the love there, the regret for time wasted, but also the hope for time they still had ahead. Then Victoria asked about Amara. She wanted to know everything. What was her life like? What were her dreams? What did she want for her future? Aunt Blessing answered some questions. She explained that Kwame, Amara's father, worked as a mechanic in Lagos, that money was always tight, that he was doing his best as a single parent but resources were limited. She mentioned that Amara attended a local school that was overcrowded and underfunded, that her obvious intelligence wasn't being challenged or developed the way it should be. Amara talked about her mother's research, pulling out one of the notebooks to show Victoria. She explained how Dr. Chioma Njoku had been working on treatments for tropical diseases that pharmaceutical companies ignored because the patients who needed them couldn't afford to pay for drugs. She told Victoria about compounds her mother had identified that showed promise for treating drug-resistant malaria, for addressing parasitic infections that killed thousands of children every year, for making existing treatments more affordable and accessible. "My mama ran out of funding," Amara said, her voice thick with emotion. She applied to so many places, tried to get grants from pharmaceutical companies, from research institutions, from anyone who would listen. But nobody wanted to fund research that wouldn't make them rich. She was working on diseases that mostly affected poor people in Africa, and that wasn't profitable enough for anyone to care. Amara's hands clenched on the notebook. "People are still dying from things that could be cured if someone just finished her research. I want to do that. I want to become a doctor like my mama and finish what she started. But I know it's probably impossible. We can barely afford my school now. Medical school, proper research facilities, all of that, it's just a dream." Victoria listened to this 9-year-old girl talk about finishing groundbreaking medical research, about saving lives, about making the world better, and she felt something shift inside her chest. This child had more purpose, more clarity about what mattered, than Victoria had possessed during 40 years of building a pharmaceutical empire. Amara wanted to save lives that pharmaceutical companies had deemed not worth saving. She wanted to finish her mother's work not for profit or recognition but because people were dying and she had the knowledge to help them. "What do you want, Amara?" Victoria asked gently. "If you could have anything, what would you want?" Amara didn't hesitate. "I want to finish my mama's research. I want to turn her discoveries into treatments that actually reach the people who need them. I want her work to matter, to save lives the way it saved yours." Victoria nodded slowly and then she smiled. Derek pulled out an envelope from his briefcase and Victoria took it, holding it for a moment before handing it to Amara. "Open it," Victoria said. Amara opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a check. She looked at the numbers, blinked, looked again. $100,000. Made out to Amara Njoku. She stared at it, unable to process what she was seeing. Aunt Blessing gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's," she started but couldn't finish the sentence. "That's a thank you," Victoria said. "A completely inadequate thank you for saving my life. But it's also a promise. A promise that your mother's work will continue, that her legacy will save lives." Victoria explained that she'd called a press conference for the following day, that she wanted Amara and Aunt Blessing to be there. There were things she wanted to announce publicly, commitments she wanted to make where the world could hold her accountable. The next day, a conference room at one of New York's most prestigious hotels was packed with media. Cameras from every major network. Reporters from international press. Medical journalists. The room buzzed with speculation about why Victoria Ashford, still recovering from her near-death experience, had called an emergency press conference. Amara sat in the front row next to Aunt Blessing, both of them overwhelmed by the lights and cameras and attention. Amara wore her best dress, which Aunt Blessing had washed and ironed that morning, and held her mother's notebook in her lap like a talisman. Victoria took the podium and the room fell silent. She looked stronger than she had just weeks ago, though still showing signs of her ordeal. She thanked everyone for coming and then got straight to the point. "2 weeks ago, I nearly died on an airplane," Victoria began. 3 excellent doctors were unable to diagnose or treat the condition that was killing me. I was minutes from death when a 9-year-old girl pushed through a crowd of adults who tried to send her away, diagnosed my condition with precision that would challenge most physicians, and prescribed a treatment protocol that saved my life. She paused, letting that sink in. That 9-year-old girl is Amara Njoku, daughter of the late Dr. Chioma Njoku, whose groundbreaking research on pharmaceutical interactions in tropical medicine I am ashamed to say my company and others in the industry largely ignored because it focused on diseases affecting poor populations in developing countries. Victoria's voice strengthened. Amara didn't just save my life. She reminded me what true brilliance looks like and what we owe to the next generation. She reminded me that knowledge without compassion is worthless, that success without purpose is hollow, and that the measure of our lives isn't what we accumulate but what we give and who we help. She gestured to Amara. "This young woman has already demonstrated more wisdom and courage than I showed in 40 years of running a pharmaceutical company. And today, I want to make several commitments to honor her and her mother's legacy." Victoria announced that she was establishing a full scholarship for Amara, covering her education from primary school through medical school, including any advanced degrees or research programs she chose to pursue. Every educational need would be met. Every opportunity would be available. Money would never be an obstacle to Amara developing her extraordinary gifts. The media scribbled furiously, cameras focused on Amara's stunned face. "But that's just the beginning," Victoria continued. "I am committing $5 million to complete Dr. Chioma Njoku's research. We will assemble a team of the best researchers in tropical medicine and pharmacology. We will develop the treatments she identified. And we will make them available at cost to the populations who need them most. Not for profit. For lives." The room erupted with questions, but Victoria held up her hand. "I'm not finished. I am establishing the Dr. Chioma Njoku Foundation for Young African Scientists. We will fund education, research opportunities, and mentorship for brilliant young people from across Africa who want to pursue careers in science and medicine. We will focus particularly on research that addresses health challenges in developing nations, the kind of work that the pharmaceutical industry has historically ignored." Victoria's eyes found Amara's in the crowd. "Dr. Njoku's research saved my life through her daughter's knowledge and courage. Now it's going to save countless other lives. That's her legacy. That's what genius in service of compassion looks like." Amara was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. Aunt Blessing had her arm around her niece, crying as well. The check for $100,000 had been overwhelming. This was beyond anything they could have imagined. Derek stepped forward with a laptop, turning it to face the audience. On the screen was a video call connection, and there, pixelated and slightly delayed, was Kwame Njoku watching from Lagos. He was in his garage, still in his work clothes, surrounded by neighbors and friends who had gathered to witness this moment. When Kwame saw his daughter on the screen, saw her sitting in that press conference receiving recognition that would change her life, he broke down completely. He was sobbing, his face in his hands, overwhelmed with pride and grief and joy all mixed together. His little girl. His brilliant, brave little girl. His late wife's daughter, carrying on her mother's legacy in ways they'd never dared to dream. Amara ran to the screen, pressing her hand against it like she could touch her father through the pixels. "Papa," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Did you hear? Did you hear what Mrs. Ashford said?" Kwame managed to nod, unable to speak. He tried several times to form words, but they kept getting lost in his tears. Finally he managed, "Your mama would be so proud. So proud. My beautiful, brilliant girl." The media captured it all. The crying father in Lagos. The overwhelmed daughter in New York. The woman who'd been saved making commitments that would honor the woman who'd saved her. It was the kind of moment that restored faith in humanity, that showed what was possible when privilege met purpose and genius met opportunity. The press conference continued with questions, but the essential story had been told. A life saved. A legacy honored. A future opened. Victoria fielded questions about the foundation, about her own recovery, about her reconciliation with her daughter. Clara, sitting in the audience, smiled and waved when cameras found her, clearly proud of her mother in a way she hadn't been in years. Reporters asked Amara what she felt, what she planned to do with this opportunity. She answered with a poise that belied her age, talking about finishing her mother's research, about wanting to help people, about how knowledge was only valuable when you used it to make the world better. One reporter asked if she was scared of the responsibility, of the pressure of being called a genius, of having the world watching her now. Amara thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. "My mama taught me that pressure is just another word for people counting on you," Amara said. "And people counting on you isn't scary. It's a privilege. It means you have something to give. Something that matters." The press conference ended, but the story was far from over. It would continue to ripple outward, inspiring conversations about education and opportunity, about recognizing genius regardless of age or background, about the responsibility of wealth and power to serve more than just profit. In her hotel room that night, Amara video called her father again, this time with Aunt Blessing beside her. They talked for hours, processing everything that had happened, everything that was going to change. Kwame kept asking if it was real, if it was really happening. The scholarship. The research funding. The foundation. It seemed too good to be true. But it was real. Victoria Ashford had committed publicly, in front of the world's media. She would be held accountable. She had given her word, and more than that, she had been given a second chance at life and she wasn't going to waste it. Amara fell asleep that night with her mother's notebook under her pillow as she always did, but for the first time since her mother's death, she fell asleep with hope. Hope that the work would continue. Hope that her mother's discoveries would save lives. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the promise she'd made at her mother's bedside was actually going to come true. Subscribe to see what happens next, because Amara's journey is just beginning, and the way this 9-year-old changes the world of medicine will absolutely inspire you. This is more than just a feel-good story, this is about what happens when genius meets opportunity and compassion meets resources. If you could make one impossible dream come true by speaking up even when no one was listening, what would it be? Let me know in the comments, because Amara's story proves that impossible dreams can become reality when courage meets the right moment. 6 months is both an eternity and an instant when your entire world has been transformed. For Amara Njoku, those 6 months felt like living in a dream she kept expecting to wake up from, except the dream kept getting better and more real with each passing day. The first day at Whitmore Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in New York City, Amara had stood at the gates feeling completely out of place. The building looked like something from a movie, all historic brick and perfectly manicured grounds. Students walked past her carrying designer backpacks, talking about summer vacations in Europe and the Hamptons. These were the children of diplomats and CEOs, of old money and new fortunes. And then there was Amara, a mechanic's daughter from Lagos, wearing a brand new uniform that still had the tags tucked inside because Aunt Blessing wanted to make sure it fit before removing them permanently. But when she walked into her first advanced science class and the teacher, Dr. Helena Price, introduced her to the other students, something shifted. Dr. Price didn't mention the plane incident or the media attention. She simply said, "This is Amara Njoku. She has a photographic memory and has mastered medical research that most of you won't encounter until graduate school. I expect you all to challenge each other and learn from each other." The students had stared, some skeptical, some curious, some clearly having recognized her from the news coverage. But then Dr. Price launched into a discussion about cellular biology, and within 10 minutes, Amara was raising her hand, offering insights from her mother's research, making connections that impressed even the teacher. By the end of the first week, her classmates had stopped seeing her as the famous kid from the news and started seeing her as simply the smartest person in the room, someone they could learn from, someone who made them better students just by being there. The advanced science program at Whitmore wasn't just high school classes. It was a pipeline to real research with partnerships at Columbia University and Mount Sinai Hospital. Students who showed exceptional promise were given opportunities to work alongside actual researchers, to contribute to real studies, to see how scientific knowledge translated into practical application. Amara had been placed into the program's most advanced track, working 3 afternoons a week at a Columbia research lab that focused on tropical medicine and infectious diseases. At first, the graduate students and postdoctoral researchers didn't quite know what to do with a 9-year-old in their lab. They gave her simple tasks, expecting her to observe and learn. But within 2 weeks, Amara was pointing out flaws in their experimental designs, suggesting alternative approaches based on her mother's research, asking questions that forced them to reconsider assumptions they'd been making for years. The lab director, Dr. Marcus Chin, a renowned expert in parasitology, had been skeptical when Victoria Ashford personally called to ask if he'd mentor Amara. He'd assumed it was a publicity stunt, a billionaire trying to manufacture a feel-good story. But after one conversation with Amara about the molecular mechanisms of drug-resistant malaria, Dr. Chen became her fiercest advocate. He assigned her to the team working on completing Dr. Chioma Njoku's research, and Amara threw herself into the work with an intensity that both impressed and worried the adults around her. She spent hours in the lab after school, on weekends, during breaks, always with one of her mother's notebooks nearby, cross-referencing the original research with the new experiments they were running. She asked to be included in team meetings where they discussed results and planned next steps. She contributed ideas that, coming from anyone else with her level of formal education, would have been dismissed immediately, but coming from Amara, backed by her mother's groundbreaking work, were taken seriously and often implemented. The research was progressing faster than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Chioma Njoku's work had been brilliant but incomplete, ideas and promising compounds that needed extensive testing and development. The team Victoria had assembled, given proper funding and resources, was turning those ideas into reality. They'd already identified 3 compounds that showed significant promise in treating drug-resistant strains of malaria, and one that could potentially make existing treatments for parasitic infections dramatically more effective and affordable. Victoria visited the lab regularly, usually on Friday afternoons, ostensibly to check on the progress of research she was funding but really to see Amara. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had quite expected. Victoria had started as a grateful patient, then become a benefactor, but somewhere along the way she'd become something more. A mentor. A second mother figure. Someone who saw in Amara not just brilliance to be supported but a young person who needed guidance, encouragement, and occasionally someone to remind her to take breaks and eat lunch. Victoria would sit in the lab's observation room, watching Amara work with the research team, and she'd think about all the years she'd spent building her pharmaceutical empire without ever feeling the sense of purpose she felt now. Watching this child honor her mother's legacy, watching treatments develop that would save lives rather than just generate profits, Victoria understood what Clara had been trying to tell her for years. Success without meaning was just accumulation. Real legacy was about what you enabled others to achieve, about what continued after you were gone. Clara often came with her mother to these Friday visits. The reconciliation between mother and daughter had been gradual, sometimes painful, full of difficult conversations about the past and careful negotiations about the future. But it was real. They had dinner together twice a week now. They talked on the phone daily. Victoria had learned to put her phone away during their time together, to really listen instead of mentally planning her next business move. Clara had learned to believe that her mother's change was genuine, that this wasn't a temporary phase but a fundamental shift in priorities. And Clara had found her own way to be part of her mother's new direction. She'd volunteered with the Dr. Chioma Njoku Foundation for Young African Scientists, using her business degree to help structure the scholarship and grant programs, traveling to Nigeria and other African countries to identify brilliant young people who needed support. She'd met dozens of students like Amara, kids with extraordinary potential trapped by circumstances of poverty and limited educational access. Helping them became Clara's passion in a way her previous career in finance had never been. Clara and Amara had formed their own relationship, separate from Victoria. Clara was like a big sister, someone who understood what it was like to live in the shadow of an accomplished parent, someone who could talk to Amara about the pressure of expectations and the loneliness of being different. They'd go to movies together, to museums, just walking around the city talking about everything and nothing. Clara made sure Amara had space to be a kid, not just a genius or a medical prodigy or a media sensation, but a 9-year-old girl who liked ice cream and funny videos and staying up too late reading. In Lagos, Kwame's life had transformed in ways that still made him emotional when he thought about it. The financial support from Victoria had allowed him to quit his second job, the overnight security work that had been destroying his health and leaving him too exhausted to be the father he wanted to be. Now he worked normal hours at the garage, made enough to live comfortably, and had time and energy to video call his daughter every single day. He'd moved them to a better apartment, nothing extravagant, but clean and safe with reliable electricity and running water. He'd been able to hire an assistant at the garage, a young man who reminded Kwame of himself 20 years ago, desperate for opportunity and willing to work hard for it. He paid the assistant well, gave him training, invested in his future the way Victoria was investing in Amara's. Kwame had also started a small community program, teaching basic mechanical skills to neighborhood kids who couldn't afford formal education. It was his way of paying forward the extraordinary fortune that had come to his family. He taught them about engines and electrical systems and problem solving, but he also told them about his daughter, about how knowledge and courage could change everything, about how you should never let anyone make you feel small because of where you came from. The research team at Columbia had reached a major milestone 4 months after Amara joined them. They'd completed development of the first treatment based on Dr. Chioma Njoku's research, a compound that enhanced the effectiveness of existing malaria treatments while reducing cost by nearly 60%. It had passed initial safety trials and was showing remarkable promise in early efficacy studies. The treatment was being fast-tracked through approval processes, with Victoria using her influence and connections to navigate regulatory requirements. But more importantly, she'd committed to manufacturing and distributing it at cost to regions where malaria was endemic. No profit margins. No executive bonuses tied to sales figures. Just medicine reaching people who needed it, the way Dr. Chioma Njoku had always envisioned. And then something happened that brought the entire journey full circle in a way that felt almost too perfect to be real. Sandra, the flight attendant who had been so kind to Amara on that fateful flight, reached out through the foundation. Her daughter Lily was 11 years old and had been sick for over a year. Doctors had run every test, tried multiple treatments, but nothing had worked. Lily was getting weaker, missing more school, and the medical bills were bankrupting Sandra's family. When the foundation's medical team reviewed Lily's case, they recognized something familiar. The symptoms matched a parasitic infection that was usually only seen in tropical regions, but Lily had never traveled outside the United States. Further investigation revealed that Lily's school had recently installed a new garden area with soil imported from overseas, likely contaminated with parasites that American doctors weren't trained to look for or treat. The diagnosis was made using protocols from Dr. Chioma Njoku's research. The treatment was one of the compounds that Amara's team at Columbia had been developing. Within 2 weeks of starting the medication, Lily's symptoms began improving. Within a month she was back in school. Within 2 months she was completely recovered. Sandra brought Lily to meet Amara, both of them crying before they even got through their thank yous. Sandra hugged Amara and whispered that somehow she'd known that day on the plane that this little girl was special, was going to change lives. She just hadn't realized that one of those lives would be her own daughter's. Amara held Lily's hand and thought about her mother, about how Dr. Chioma Njoku had dedicated her life to saving children like Lily, children dying from treatable conditions simply because the research and medications didn't exist or weren't accessible. This was why her mother's work mattered. This was what legacy looked like. Not papers published in journals that only other researchers read, but a smiling 11-year-old girl who got to grow up because someone had cared enough to do the research and someone else had cared enough to finish it. The months built on each other, each week bringing new developments, new connections, new evidence that the decision to listen to a 9-year-old girl on an airplane had set in motion changes that extended far beyond one saved life. The foundation had awarded its first round of scholarships to 32 students from 12 African countries. Young people studying medicine, biology, chemistry, engineering, all dedicated to solving problems in their own communities. Clara managed the program with passionate efficiency, making sure every student had not just financial support but mentorship, resources, and a network of people invested in their success. Dr. Cho, Dr. Mills, and Dr. Kowalski, the three doctors from the plane, had all stayed in touch with Amara. They visited her at the lab, amazed to see her working alongside professional researchers. Dr. Mills had written a paper about the incident for a major medical journal, using it to discuss the importance of remaining open to diagnostic input from unexpected sources and the dangers of dismissing people based on age, appearance, or credentials. The paper had sparked important conversations in medical education about intellectual humility and the need to listen rather than assume. Dr. Cho had joined the Foundation's Medical Advisory Board, helping to identify research priorities and evaluate grant applications. He told Victoria privately that meeting Amara, seeing how her mother's work had continued through her, had reminded him why he'd gone into medicine in the first place. Not for prestige or income, but to save lives and advance knowledge that help people. And now, 6 months after that flight, Amara stood backstage at the International Conference on Tropical Medicine and Global Health, waiting to give a presentation to a room full of some of the most accomplished medical researchers in the world. She was 9 years old, wearing a dress that Clara had helped her pick out, holding note cards that she'd prepared with Dr. Chen's guidance, and she was absolutely terrified. The conference organizers had been hesitant when Victoria proposed that Amara present the findings on Dr. Amara Njoku's research. A 9-year-old addressing a room of PhDs and MDs? It was unprecedented. Potentially inappropriate. But Victoria had insisted, and Dr. Chen had backed her up, arguing that Amara hadn't just inherited her mother's research, she'd contributed meaningfully to its completion. She deserved to present it. The moderator introduced her, summarizing the plane incident briefly before focusing on the research itself, on Dr. Amara Njoku's pioneering work and the progress that had been made in the 6 months since her daughter had saved Victoria Ashford's life. Then Amara walked onto the stage and the room fell silent. She looked impossibly small behind the podium, even with the platform they provided so she could reach the microphone. 300 medical professionals watched this child, some curious, some skeptical, some already inspired just by seeing her there. Amara had given presentations before to her class, to small groups at the lab, but never anything like this. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the podium. She looked out at the audience and saw Victoria and Clara in the third row, both smiling encouragingly. She saw Dr. Chen near the back giving her a thumbs up. She saw Sandra and Lily sitting together, Lily holding a sign that said, "Thank you, Amara." And she began to speak. She talked about her mother's research, about the years Dr. Amara Njoku had spent studying drug interactions and developing treatments for diseases that pharmaceutical companies ignored. Amara's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the nervousness fading as she lost herself in the material she knew so well. She presented the data on the 3 compounds they developed, explaining the mechanisms of action, the trial results, the potential impact on global health. She used technical language perfectly, but she also made it accessible, telling stories about patients like Lily, about communities that would benefit, about the real human impact behind the statistics and molecular diagrams. The audience listened with rapt attention. This wasn't a child reading from a script. This was someone who deeply understood the material, who could answer questions with nuance and depth, who saw the research not as abstract science but as a tool for saving lives. Amara's presentation was scheduled for 20 minutes, but she finished her prepared remarks in 15. She paused, looking at her note cards, and then set them aside. What she said next wasn't in her notes, hadn't been practiced or approved by anyone. It came straight from her heart. "My mother used to tell me that one person with knowledge and courage can change everything," Amara said, her voice clear and strong in the hushed conference hall. She was right. But she also taught me that we're not meant to do this alone. Every person I've met since that plane taught me something important. She looked at Dr. Cho in the audience. Dr. Cho taught me that humility makes you better. He was willing to listen to someone he had every reason to dismiss, and that openness saved a life. Her eyes found Dr. Mills. Dr. Mills taught me that admitting you're wrong takes strength. She apologized to me when she didn't have to, and that taught me that real confidence means being able to change your mind when presented with new information. She looked at Victoria and Clara. Mrs. Ashford taught me that it's never too late to change. She could have gone back to her life after recovering and never thought about me again. Instead, she honored my mother's legacy and gave me the chance to continue her work. She chose meaning over money, and that choice is saving lives. Amara's voice softened, became thick with emotion. And my mama taught me that love and knowledge are the only things we leave behind that truly matter. She died before she could finish her research, but the love she put into it, The compassion that drove every experiment and every late night in her lab, that lived on. It lived on in her notebooks. It lived on in me. And now it's living on in the treatments we're developing, in the foundation bearing her name, in every student getting a scholarship, in every patient getting medicine they couldn't afford before. She paused, tears shining in her eyes but not falling. One person with knowledge and courage can start the change. But it takes a community to make it last. It takes doctors willing to listen. It takes billionaires willing to invest in more than profit. It takes researchers willing to finish someone else's work. It takes families willing to support each other across continents. It takes all of us working together, believing that every life matters enough to save. The silence that followed lasted for 3 full seconds, and then the room erupted. 300 medical professionals rose to their feet in a standing ovation that went on for over 2 minutes. Doctors who had spent decades in research, who had published hundreds of papers, who had saved countless lives, stood and applauded a 9-year-old girl who had just reminded them why they dedicated their lives to medicine in the first place. Victoria and Clara were crying openly, holding each other, overwhelmed by pride and emotion. Dr. Chin was clapping so hard his hands hurt, his face split by an enormous smile. Sandra lifted Lily up so she could see over the crowd, both of them cheering. Dr. Cho, Dr. Mills, and Dr. Kowalski stood together, wiping away tears, knowing that the decision to listen to this child 6 months ago had led to this moment, to this change, to this legacy. In Lagos it was late evening. Kwame had set up a laptop in his garage, inviting neighbors and friends to watch the live stream of Amara's presentation. 30 people crowded into the small space, watching the grainy video feed, listening to this child from their community address an international medical conference. When Amara finished speaking, when the standing ovation began, the garage in Lagos erupted as well. People cheered and cried and hugged Kwame, who was sobbing with pride so intense it felt like his chest might burst. His daughter. His brilliant, courageous daughter. His late wife's legacy, living and breathing and changing the world. The livestream camera caught Kwame's face, tear-streaked and glowing with pride, and the conference organizers, moved by the moment, put his image on the main screen beside Amara. Father and daughter, separated by an ocean but connected by love and pride and the legacy of a woman who had believed that one person could make a difference. Amara looked up at the screen, saw her father, and her composure finally broke. She waved to him, crying and laughing at the same time, and the audience loved her even more for being both brilliant and beautifully, perfectly human. The conference continued after Amara's presentation, but nothing else that day matched the emotional impact of those 30 minutes. Attendees approached her during breaks, telling her about their own research, asking about her mother's work, treating her not as a curiosity but as a colleague. She exchanged contact information with researchers from 4 continents, all wanting to collaborate, to contribute, to be part of what Dr. Chioma Njoku had started and what her daughter was continuing. That evening, back at Aunt Blessing's apartment, which they'd kept even though Victoria had offered to move them somewhere more spacious, Amara sat with her mother's notebooks spread around her. Victoria and Clara had come over, bringing Thai food and chocolate cake, turning it into a celebration. Dr. Chin had stopped by briefly, as had Sandra and Lily. Even Aunt Blessing, who usually worked evening shifts, had taken the night off to be there. They sat around the small living room, eating and laughing and recounting the day. Amara was exhausted but happy, still processing the standing ovation, the respect she'd received, the knowledge that her mother's work was truly making a difference. Victoria watched Amara, this remarkable child who had saved her life and in doing so, had saved Victoria from a life of empty success. She thought about the person she'd been 6 months ago, so focused on profit and power that she'd lost her own daughter, so disconnected from purpose that she couldn't even recognize she was dying until it was almost too late. Everything had changed because Amara had refused to stay silent. Because she'd valued a stranger's life enough to risk humiliation and dismissal. Because she believed that knowledge was worthless if you didn't use it to help people. Late that night, after everyone had left and Amara was getting ready for bed, she opened her mother's first notebook to the dedication page she'd read 1,000 times. Dr. Chioma Njoku had written it the year Amara was born, a message to her future daughter. To my Amara, my precious gift. If you're reading this, I hope I've taught you that intelligence without compassion is just cleverness, and knowledge without courage is just information. Use what I've given you. Help people. Change things. Make the world remember that we were here and that we mattered. All my love always, Mama. Amara traced her mother's handwriting with one finger and she whispered into the quiet room, I did it, Mama. We're helping people. We're changing things. The world will remember you. I promise. She closed the notebook gently and placed it beside her bed, next to the photograph of her and her mother taken when Amara was 6, both of them laughing at something off camera, caught in a moment of pure joy. That photograph had survived everything: her mother's illness, the grief afterward, the move to America, all of it. And it would survive everything that came next too, a reminder of where she came from and why she was doing this work. Because in the end, that's what legacy really is. Not the buildings named after you or the money you accumulate or even the discoveries you make. Legacy is the love you pour into the world, the knowledge you share, the courage you inspire in others, and the ripples that extend outward from one moment of choosing to help rather than to stay silent. 6 months ago, a 9-year-old girl refused to accept that adults knew better simply because they were older. She trusted her knowledge, honored her mother's research, and saved a life. That one act of courage had cascaded into scholarships for dozens of students, into medical research that would save thousands of lives, into a reconciliation between mother and daughter, into a foundation that would continue long after everyone involved was gone. Never underestimate someone based on their age or appearance, because brilliance doesn't wait for permission to speak and courage doesn't ask for credentials before acting. Knowledge combined with compassion changes lives, and second chances given freely create opportunities for transformation that ripple outward in ways we can never fully predict or control. One moment of courage created a cascade of change. One child's voice, insisting on being heard, saved not just a life but countless lives that would be touched by the research, the foundation, the treatments, and the example of what's possible when we listen to each other across divides of age and experience and expectation. And somewhere, in whatever exists beyond this life, Dr. Chioma Njoku was smiling, knowing that her work had continued, that her daughter had kept her promise, and that love and knowledge, given freely and used bravely, really were the only things that mattered in the end. The photo of young Amara with her mother remained beside her bed, two faces smiling forever in a captured moment of joy, a reminder that the best of who we are lives on in the people we love, in the knowledge we share, and in the courage we inspire in those who come after us. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that one moment of courage can change everything, then subscribe, because stories like Amara's prove that the extraordinary exists in ordinary moments when ordinary people choose to be brave. What's one moment where you wish you'd spoken up but stayed silent? What would you do differently now? Share in the comments, because maybe Amara's story will give you the courage to use your voice the next time it matters.